Welcome to CraftLit, the podcast for crafters who like books. My name is Heather Wardover, and I'm podcasting from my corner of the Sonoran Desert, the Old Pueblo, Tucson, Arizona. Episode 75, Isn't It Romantic? Well, hello! Oh, I am so tired. So here's the thing. Before we dive into Frankenstein, we need to establish some ground rules, and the ground rules are about the romantics. Most of us, when we think of romantic, we are thinking of lowercase r romantic. That's kind of the Hallmark card romantic. That's the romantic of the ooey gooey spongy feeling that you get when you look at someone you love, or when you looked at someone you love when that love was new. That's the kind of Did that sound jaded? Honestly, the funny thing is I still look at my husband like that, which is on the whole really very cool. But that's lowercase r romantic. When people talk about the romantics, they are speaking of a group of people who were responding to the Enlightenment and rationality and science by saying, there is more to heaven and earth, Horatio, than is dreamt of in your philosophy. They came in and said, intuition matters. And there are things that occur in life that simply cannot be explained scientifically or rationally. And nature is beautiful and awesome in the original sense of the word, and spectacular. And all of these things, when you look at them and you spend a lot of time looking at them, which these gentlemen and women did, all of these things really move the soul in very meaningful ways. And gee, wouldn't it be nice to start paying attention to these things again? That's one of the basic themes that runs throughout romantic poetry and romantic literature. However, what this inevitably did was descend into Gothic literature, because if you spend that much time navel gazing or that much time focusing on, well, things like the supernatural, eventually stuff's going to start getting creepy. Samuel Taylor Coleridge is an excellent example of someone who had a very difficult time um, keeping up with this outlook. And he wound up getting rather depressed and eventually addicted to laudanum. And some of his best poems came out of laudanum stupors. Kubla Khan was something that frustrated him for the rest of his life, because he came out of a laudanum episode and scribbled down as much as he could remember of the poem that was floating around his mind during that episode. And then someone knocked on the door and pulled him out of that reverie, and he was never able to capture the end of the poem again, at least not to his satisfaction. Shelley led a rather tortured existence. He had a first wife, and then he had Mary Shelley as a very, very, very young second wife. And his first marriage was fraught and ended badly, as all things fraught do. There's Lord Byron, George Gordon Lord Byron, who was hot. And when I mean hot, I mean like Rupert Everett in An Ideal Husband hot. He was the playboy of the Western world. And at least bi-curious, if not actively bi. He wrote a lot of wonderful literature that we will not be listening to early on. I may kick in and play some of his stuff later, but he's difficult. Although honestly, anyone could read She Walks in Beauty Like the Night and get the picture. And then there's Wordsworth, who was kind of the granddaddy of all of them. And we will start with Wordsworth tonight. You can go back as far as William Blake, the guy who did Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bright and Little Lamb Who Made Thee. And he is often wrapped up with the romantics, but he's kind of the weird fringe early point to all things romantic. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is more or less the death knell of the romantic movement, at least in Britain. After that, things started to change more, and the Industrial Revolution really took hold, and Dickens started. For tonight's episode, I had an opportunity to sit down with Elizabeth, one of our listeners, who teaches Shakespeare and romantic literature and women's literature and a whole bunch of other cool stuff. And so this is our conversation introducing 4 poems from the Romantics.
So, I thought maybe we should start with the depressing ones first,
Sure.
and then end with the birdies.
Yeah, well, I guess it depends on how you read the Wordsworth, whether you think it's depressing or not. I kind of feel, I'm in both minds about it. I kind of think it's depressing, and I kind of think it is uplifting in some ways. So,
Yeah, I was actually thinking more about the Coleridge being
oh yeah,
the kicker.
yeah, yeah. Well, he was pretty depressed as a person.
He
So,
was a character. Well, first, I mean, when I introduce the Romantics, I'm going to introduce kind of the big picture of the Romantics
hmm
as the people who are interested in spirituality and nature, and then on the weird side, the ones who were interested in the supernatural, which is where we wind up getting into Frankenstein.
right,
But with Wordsworth and Coleridge, to people who don't know a whole lot about the Romantics, Wordsworth and Coleridge are going to look like a strange combination to begin with,
yeah,
because Wordsworth tends to be thought of as kind of an upbeat guy, and Coleridge is the guy who was on drugs who wrote Kubla Khan
yeah.
and Rime of the Ancient Mariner. So where do we start with the parallel between the two of them?
I actually think if we look at the Immortality Ode and Dejection, they're asking pretty similar questions. In fact, I think that Coleridge wrote Dejection initially responding to the Immortality Ode, and I think he was only responding to the first few stanzas because Wordsworth and Coleridge were close friends, and they circulated their manuscripts to each other before they were published. So the Immortality Ode and opens with the phrase "There was a time." And then
Mm-hmm.
Coleridge uses that phrase in Dejection, there was a time, and what they're saying is there was a time when, nature was wonderful and I felt happy, and now I'm depressed, essentially. I mean, Wordsworth says that right at the beginning. There was a time when meadow, grove, and stream was apparelled in celestial light. It is not now as it has been of yore. The things which I have seen, I now can see no more. And Coleridge is essentially saying the same thing. There was a time when I could experience joy, and now I can't. Now I'm just depressed,
Yeah, I
essentially.
guess one of the things that I thought was interesting was I kind of felt like Wordsworth, and maybe this is just where they both fall artistically, is that Wordsworth is more external and Coleridge is more internal.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Definitely. And I think that has to do with how they see, the interactions with nature. In Dejection, Coleridge really, I think, comes out of that poem not finding any possibility of nature giving him anything anymore. I mean, where does he say it? He says, I may not hope from outward forms to win the passion and the life whose fountains are within. And he says, in our life alone does nature live. It has to come from inside, he says. I can't get anything from nature anymore. It's not going to help me. I have to pull myself out of this or nothing, essentially.
Which is
And
pretty
words,
tough when you're Coleridge.
I'm sorry.
Which is pretty tough to do when you're Coleridge.
Yeah. After, you're addicted to the laudanum and all of that stuff. My students always loved that when I told them that he was a drug addict. I don't know. Somehow
Oh
it made
yeah.
them, you know, feel more connected to him, some of them at
Well,
least. I don't
yeah.
know. Um,
I don't think that these guys feel so old when you find out that Thoreau was the original hippie and that Coleridge was addicted to drugs. They don't feel so crusty.
exactly. Yeah, yeah. It's not like they're just, sitting up in some ivory tower writing poetry or something.
Exactly.
But Wordsworth, I think, he has the same dilemma. How can I recapture the joy that I once felt that I took in nature? And he concludes, well, essentially the same thing as Coleridge. I can't. But his reaction is more positive, which is that he says, well, nothing can bring back the hour of splendor in the grass and in glory in the flower, but I'm not going to grieve. I will take strength from what remains behind, from the philosophic mind, from being. I can still be in nature and still enjoy it. It's just that now I'm an adult, and I have to console myself with philosophy, essentially. Um,
Did-
Sorry,
Do
go
you
ahead.
think that some of the well, do you think that some of this with the two of them, I can't remember how old they were when they wrote this, but is some of this
Mhm.
just an ode to lost youth? It's not so much a change in the external world, um, or a loss of appreciation for nature as much as it is I'm not able to roll around in the grass anymore and
Yeah,
life is passing me by.
definitely. It looks like they weren't that. I mean, Coleridge was born in 1772. I have my book in front of me, just so you know.
Oh, good. I couldn't print these out before I called you because I don't have a printer here, so I'm looking at a screen.
Oh, I have my trusty Norton Anthology of Literature in front of me. So, yeah,
Okay.
Coleridge was born in 1772, and I think the poem was 1802. So that would only make him, what, 30
30 something,
when he's
yeah.
writing this? And I think Wordsworth's roughly the same. So, yeah, for Wordsworth, he articulates that very fully in the Immortality Ode, that he looks at the children who are bounding around and having fun, and he really envies them, and he sees the process of aging as, you move away from the light, essentially. Heaven surrounds us in our infancy, and as you get older, the prison house closes on you, he says. So he really is jealous. I think he's envious of the children because they can just enjoy and they don't think about suffering and death and all this other stuff that you have to think about when you get older.
That is boy, that just kind of nails the whole romantic philosophy too, doesn't it? That
Yeah,
the kind of the childlike nature is the pure, and that's why you go back to nature itself because it's pure
yeah.
and untouched by these worries and these woes.
Mhm.
And
Definitely.
it is kind of like the romantic Bible.
Mhm. Yeah, and that's why Wordsworth and Coleridge are so important. I mean, when they published lyrical ballads, that was revolutionary, and they intended it to be. I mean, they really wanted to revolutionize the way poetry was being written, and how feeling was expressed in literature. So,
Was there much of a backlash? It's one of the things that I never learned in my classes. The My understanding was that the Romantic movement grew out of the Enlightenment, out of the tail end of the Enlightenment, and was in fact a reaction to the kind of uber rationality that was going on
yeah.
in the world at the time. Was there a backlash from the older people kind of saying, "You young kids, you don't know anything," and, these upstarts coming in and talking about nature and immortality, "Pah, you should be looking at the facts," and
I think so, and this is where we get into the fact simply that I'm just not a romantic scholar, but I do seem to remember that that there was definitely that this is a controversial work, lyrical ballads, and I mean they were challenging a lot, as you say, of the ideas that were held at the time, saying, well, we don't have to be concerned with reason, we want to talk about imagination, and emotion and individual consciousness, and the internal, not the external, and yeah, in an age of scientific advancement and in the industrial revolution and all of that stuff, I believe it was quite controversial. They also
it's
just wanted to challenge the poetic forms of the previous century, that um
Oh.
people like Pope, who I'm also not a fan of,
Right.
and Dryden and people like that, that they just felt that this is too constrictive, that, poetry was too artificial. And I love the Wordsworth said that poetry should be the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. And
Oh, that's right.
yeah, and that's a phrase that really I remember from my undergraduate romantics class, because I just at the time I was like, yeah, yeah, it really appealed to my 19-year-old self, and
Yeah.
I liked that idea much more than the kind of highly formal, very structured, previous sorts of forms, which is very ironic given that now I spend my time studying Shakespeare, who wrote in a very, a very sort of highly formal kind of structure, especially in the sonnet.
Yeah, but
But
So I thought I'd stop here and let you actually hear Intimations of Immortality and Dejection, an ode. The first is by Wordsworth, and the second is by Coleridge.
Ode, Intimations of Immortality from Recollections of Early Childhood. Read for LibriVox by Elizabeth Klett. There was a time when meadow, grove, and stream, the earth and every common sight, to me did seem apparelled in celestial light, the glory and the freshness of a dream. It is not now as it hath been of yore. Turn wheresoe'er I may, by night or day, the things which I have seen, I now can see no more. The rainbow comes and goes, and lovely is the rose. The moon doth with delight look round her when the heavens are bare. Waters on a starry night are beautiful and fair. The sunshine is a glorious birth. But yet I know, where'er I go, that there hath passed away a glory from the earth. Now, while the birds sing a joyous song, and while the young lambs bound as to the Tabor's sound, to me alone there came a thought of grief. A timely utterance gave that thought relief, and I again am strong. The cataracts blow their trumpets from the steep. No more shall grief of mine the season wrong. I hear the echoes through the mountains throng. The winds come to me from the fields of sleep, and all the earth is gay. Land and sea give themselves up to jollity, and with the heart of May doth every beast keep holiday. Thou child of joy, shout round me, let me hear thy shouts, thou happy shepherd boy. Ye blessed creatures, I have heard the call ye to each other make. I see the heavens laugh with you in your jubilee. My heart is at your festival. My head hath its coronal. The fullness of your bliss I feel it all. O evil day! If I were sullen, while earth herself is adorning this sweet May morning, and the children are culling on every side in 1,000 valleys far and wide fresh flowers, while the sun shines warm and the babe leaps up on his mother's arm, I hear, with joy I hear. But there's a tree, of many, one, a single field which I have looked upon. Both of them speak of something that is gone. The pansy at my feet doth the same tale repeat. Whither is fled the visionary gleam? Where is it now, the glory and the dream? Our birth is but a sleep and a forgetting. The soul that rises with us, our life's star, hath had elsewhere its setting and cometh from afar. Not in entire forgetfulness, and not in utter nakedness, but trailing clouds of glory do we come from God who is our home. Heaven lies about us in our infancy. Shades of the prison house begin to close upon the growing boy. But he beholds the light, and whence it flows, he sees it in his joy. The youth, who daily farther from the east must travel, still is nature's priest, and by the vision splendid is on his way attended. At length, the man perceives it die away, and fade into the light of common day. Earth fills her lap with pleasures of her own, yearnings she hath in her own natural kind, and even with something of a mother's mind, and no unworthy aim, the homely nurse doth all she can to make her foster child, her inmate man, forget the glories he hath known, and that imperial palace whence he came. Behold the child among his newborn blisses, a 6 years' darling of a pygmy size. See, where mid-work of his own hand he lies, fretted by sallies of his mother's kisses, with light upon him from his father's eyes. See at his feet some little plan or chart, some fragment from his dream of human life, shaped by himself with newly learned art, a wedding or a festival, a mourning or a funeral. And this hath now his heart, and unto this he frames his song. Then will he fit his tongue to dialogues of business, love, or strife. But it will not be long ere this be thrown aside, and with new joy and pride the little actor cons another part, filling from time to time his humorous stage with all the persons down to palsied age that life brings with her in her equipage, as if his whole vocation were endless imitation. Thou, whose exterior semblance doth belie thy soul's immensity, thou best philosopher, who yet doth keep thy heritage, thou eye among the blind, that deaf and silent reads the eternal deep, haunted forever by the eternal mind, mighty prophet, seer blessed, on whom those truths do rest which we are toiling all our lives to find, in darkness lost, the darkness of the grave. Thou, over whom thy immortality broods like the day, a master or a slave, a presence which is not to be put by, to whom the grave is but a lonely bed without the sense or sight of day or the warm light, a place of thought where we in waiting lie. Thou little child, yet glorious in the might of heaven-born freedom on thy being's height, why, with such earnest pains dost thou provoke the years to bring the inevitable yoke, thus blindly with thy blessedness at strife? Full soon thy soul shall have her earthly freight, and custom lie upon thee with a weight heavy as frost and deep almost as life. O joy, that in our embers is something that doth live, that nature yet remembers what was so fugitive. The thought of our past years in me doth breed perpetual benediction, not indeed for that which is most worthy to be blessed, delight and liberty, the simple creed of childhood, whether busy or at rest, with new-fledged hope still fluttering in his breast. Not for these I raise the song of thanks and praise, but for those obstinate questionings of sense and outward things, fallings from us, vanishings, blank misgivings of a creature moving about in worlds not realized, high instincts before which our mortal nature did tremble like a guilty thing surprised. But for those first affections, those shadowy recollections, which, be they what they may, are yet the fountain light of all our day, are yet a master light of all our seeing, uphold us, cherish, and have power to make our noisy years seem moments in the being of the eternal silence, truths that wake to perish never, which neither listlessness, nor mad endeavor, nor man, nor boy, nor all that is at enmity with joy can utterly abolish or destroy. Hence, in a season of calm weather, though inland far we be, our souls have sight of that immortal sea which brought us hither, can in a moment travel thither, and see the children sport upon the shore, and hear the mighty waters rolling evermore. Then sing, ye birds, sing, sing a joyous song, and let the young lambs bound as to the Tabor's sound. We, in thought, will join your throng. Ye that pipe, and ye that play, ye that through your hearts today feel the gladness of the May. What though the radiance which was once so bright be now forever taken from my sight? Though nothing can bring back the hour of splendor in the grass, of glory in the flower, we will grieve not, rather find strength in what remains behind. In the primal sympathy, which having been must ever be, in the soothing thoughts that spring out of human suffering, in the faith that looks through death, in years that bring the philosophic mind. And oh, ye fountains, meadows, hills, and groves, forebode not any severing of our loves. Yet in my heart of hearts I feel your might. I only have relinquished one delight to live beneath your more habitual sway. I love the brooks which down their channels fret even more than when I tripped lightly as they. The innocent brightness of a newborn day is lovely yet. The clouds that gather round the setting sun do take a sober coloring from an eye that hath kept watch o'er man's mortality. Another race hath been, and other palms are won. Thanks to the human heart by which we live, thanks to its tenderness, its joys and fears. To me the meanest flower that blows can give thoughts that do often lie too deep for tears. End of poem.
All right, so there's your Wordsworth. Now we're going to catch up with Coleridge, who was responding to this poem and not quite so happy. But then, it's Coleridge.
Dejection, an Ode, by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Read for LibriVox.org by Elizabeth Klett. Late, late yestreen I saw the new moon, with the old moon in her arms, and I fear, my master dear, we shall have a deadly storm. Ballad of Sir Patrick Spens. Well, if the bard was weatherwise who made the grand old ballad of Sir Patrick Spens, this night, so tranquil now, will not go hence unroused by winds that ply a busier trade than those which mould yon cloud in lazy flakes, or the dull sobbing draught that moans and rakes upon the strings of this Aeolian lute, which better far were mute. For lo, the new moon winter bright, and overspread with phantom light, with swimming phantom light o'erspread, but rimmed and circled by a silver thread, I see the old moon in her lap, foretelling the coming on of rain and squally blast. And oh, that even now the gust were swelling, and the slant night shower driving loud and fast. Those sounds which oft have raised me, whilst they awed and sent my soul abroad, might now perhaps their wonted impulse give, might startle this dull pain, and make it move and live. A grief without a pang, void, dark, and drear, a stifled, drowsy, unimpassioned grief, which finds no natural outlet, no relief in word or sigh or tear. O lady, in this wan and heartless mood, to other thoughts by yonder throstle wooed, all this long eve, so balmy and serene, have I been gazing on the western sky and its peculiar tint of yellow-green. And still I gaze, and with how blank an eye! And those thin clouds above in flakes and bars that give away their motion to the stars, those stars that glide behind them or between, now sparkling, now bedimmed, but always seen. Yon crescent moon, as fixed as if it grew in its own cloudless, starless lake of blue. I see them all so excellently fair. I see, not feel, how beautiful they are. My genial spirits fail. And what can these avail to lift the smothering weight from off my breast? It were a vain endeavour, though I should gaze forever on that green light that lingers in the west. I may not hope from outward forms to win the passion and the life whose fountains are within. O Lady, we receive but what we give, and in our life alone does nature live. Ours is her wedding garment, ours her shroud. And would we aught behold of higher worth than that inanimate cold world allowed to the poor loveless, ever anxious crowd? Ah, from the soul itself must issue forth a light, a glory, a fair luminous cloud enveloping the earth. And from the soul itself must there be sent a sweet and potent voice, of its own birth, of all sweet sounds the life and element. O pure of heart, thou needst not ask of me what this strong music in the soul may be, what and wherein it doth exist, this light, this glory, this fair luminous mist, this beautiful and beauty-making power. Joy, virtuous lady, joy that ne'er was given, save to the pure, and in their purest hour, life and life's effluence cloud at once and shower. Joy, lady, is the spirit and the power which wedding nature to us gives in dower. A new earth and new heaven, undreamt of by the sensual and the proud. Joy is the sweet voice, joy the luminous cloud. We in ourselves rejoice. And thence flows all that charms or ear or sight, all melodies the echoes of that voice, all colours a suffusion from that light. There was a time when, though my path was rough, this joy within me dallied with distress, and all misfortunes were but as the stuff whence fancy made me dreams of happiness. For hope grew round me, like the twining vine, and fruits and foliage not my own, seemed mine. But now afflictions bow me down to earth, nor care I that they rob me of my mirth. But oh, each visitation suspends what nature gave me at my birth, my shaping spirit of imagination. For not to think of what I needs must feel, but to be still and patient all I can, and haply by abstruse research to steal from my own nature all the natural man. This was my sole resource, my only plan, till that which suits a part infects the whole, and now is almost grown the habit of my soul. Hence, viper thoughts that coil around my mind, reality's dark dream. I turn from you, and listen to the wind, which long has raved unnoticed. What a scream of agony by torture lengthened out that lute sent forth. Thou wind, that ravest without, bare crag or mountain tarn or blasted tree, or pine grove whither woodmen never clomb, or lonely house long held the witch's home, methinks were fitter instruments for thee, mad lutanist, who in this month of showers, of dark brown gardens and of peeping flowers, makest devil's Yule, with worse than wintry song, the blossoms, buds, and timorous leaves among. Thou actor, perfect in all tragic sounds, thou mighty poet, even to frenzy bold, what tell'st thou now about? 'Tis of the rushing of an host in rout, with groans of trampled men, with smarting wounds. At once they groan with pain and shudder with the cold. But hush, there is a pause of deepest silence, and all that noise is of a rushing crowd, with groans and tremulous shudderings. All is over. It tells another tale, with sounds less deep and loud, a tale of less affright, and tempered with delight, as Otway's self had framed the tender lay. 'Tis of a little child, upon a lonesome wild, not far from home, but she hath lost her way, and now moans low in bitter grief and fear, and now screams loud, and hopes to make her mother hear. 'Tis midnight, but small thoughts have I of sleep. Full seldom may my friend such vigils keep. Visit her, gentle sleep, with wings of healing, and may this storm be but a mountain birth. May all the stars hang bright above her dwelling, silent as though they watched the sleeping earth. With light heart may she rise, gay fancy, cheerful eyes. Joy lift her spirit, joy attune her voice. To her may all things live from pole to pole, their life the eddying of her living soul. O simple spirit, guided from above, dear lady, friend devoutest of my choice, thus mayst thou ever, evermore rejoice.
So that's the beginning of our listen to romantic poetry. We are going to go back to my conversation with Elizabeth. I actually cut us off midstream because we started to talk about structure and structured writing and Shakespeare. And that actually leads into what we're going to do next, which is listen to a little Shelley and Keats. So I'm going to let us pick up the conversation where we ended, right there with Shakespeare.
It's hard not see, and this is where I become a real lover of Shakespeare. It's hard not to feel, even within the constrained forms that he writes in,
Yeah.
it's hard not to feel that it is a spontaneous overflow of emotion coming from him as well.
Oh, yeah.
He just happened to be able to do it in iambic pentameter.
Exactly. I think that is one of the things I love about him is that he does combine the two things to highly structured, very formal form. And then the content, you're right, it seems like it's just this natural overflow of thought that the characters are kind of spilling out, especially in soliloquies and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I think when we studied Marlowe, and I read a fragment of something else, but I read Dr. Faustus, I can't even remember how many times.
Mm-hmm.
But it didn't feel that way. I had just assumed that Shakespeare wrote the way people wrote
Mm-hmm.
around him, and it's not. He's very, very different.
Yeah, he is, which is why it's so absurd that some people think that, Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare, that it was Marlowe or somebody else.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, because Marlowe could have switched Faustus off and all the kind of mannered writing that he did in that, and he could just turn on, Mercutio.
Yeah, exactly. Also, there's the small problem that, Marlowe died in 1593 and Shakespeare wrote until 1613, 1614.
Trifles. Mere trifles in
Exactly.
the
We
face
can
of,
get around
of
that.
people who are certain. No, and it is the whole. I find I've been writing poetry recently on demand
Mm-hmm.
for test prep passages, and they will send me a prototype and say you have to match the line structure
Really?
and the punctuation.
Huh.
So I have to match, if it's a rhyme, I have to match the rhyme. If it's unrhymed, I have to match as close as I can to the syllable
Right.
count and then the punctuation, but they'll give me a new topic.
Right.
And I have found it to be a fascinating procedure because I can do a very specific and intricate replacement of syllables,
Uh-huh.
and switch it from a poem about a frog to a poem about a bird.
Mm-hmm.
And I can keep everything, but it won't make sense.
Right.
And then I have to go back and change stuff. And I write to them and say, in order to make this actually a poem that doesn't feel like it was put together by a computer,
Yeah.
I did have to change punctuation and I did have to change syllables because it can't be, it's not a sonnet.
Right.
It's not a sonnet form.
Right.
And there was a wonderful, what book was that in? Oh, A Wrinkle in Time, Madeleine L'Engle's book.
I love that book.
Do you remember the part where Meg was complaining about being constrained and having rules, and Miss Whatsit said to her, think of a sonnet.
Oh, yeah.
There's a very specific structure, but within it, you have complete freedom.
Right.
And all of a sudden I thought, this is the problem. Some days I think this is the problem with our country, but the idea that having limits placed on you is bad instead of having limits placed on you makes you more creative.
Right. Right.
You have, and it's human nature to do that and to go there. And then once you've mastered those structures, to break them, which I think is where the romantics come in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's also not necessarily, I don't mean to give the impression that they were saying like, oh, forms just go out the window or something like that.
No,
Like,
because Shelley wrote sonnets, Ozymandias, and
definitely. And you can see even in the Skylark that, the poetic form is very set. It's very, I think there's 4 lines in each stanza, and there's a rhyme scheme, and et cetera. And so it seems very kind of 5 lines in each stanza. But so yeah, you're right. There's a structure in place, but freedom within that structure is unlimited. So,
Which I think is so cool. And that actually brings us into Shelley and Keats.
mhm.
I got to go to the Shelley and Keats Museum
Really?
in Rome. So I got to see Keats. There was a life mask and a death mask.
Uh-huh.
He was quite a handsome young man. Even dead, I can see why people were all hot and bothered over these guys.
Yeah.
And my husband told me that there's a statue of Shelley at University College at Oxford. And when he did a summer school program there about 4 years earlier than I did mine, and he said the girls in his program one night all snuck out, took off their clothes, and photographed themselves draped over Shelley's statue of him washed up on the beach.
That is awesome.
Isn't that classic?
Oh my God. What is that about the I mean, I swear to you, when I took the romantics class as an undergraduate, I think I was a sophomore, I just kind of had a little crush on my teacher. And I think it was because he kind of channeled the romantics, and he just read them so passionately. He wasn't necessarily like the best looking man, but and it wasn't
Didn't
just
matter.
me either. A lot of the girls in the class were kind of like, oh.
Did you write "I love you" on your eyelids like the girl did in Reader's Digest?
Yeah, I wasn't that bold, actually. He probably never knew how I felt about him. He probably, I don't know, maybe he does know. Who knows? Maybe he actively cultivates it. But yeah, he was just so into the romantics, and he read them with such passion in class. So it appealed to my little 19-year-old self.
Well, yeah, and I had a boy who was a gang member in New York
Mm.
who never did a stitch of work in my class, and it was sophomore year, and we did the Romantics and Frankenstein,
Mm-hmm.
and we'd made it through just a couple poems, maybe it was only Shelley and Keats at that point because I saved Coleridge for the end, and he came up to me one day and he said, "Those are my people."
Really?
And that was all he said, and then he walked out, and I thought, "Well, I'm not gonna miss this opportunity," and I went out and bought a book of romantic poetry, and I bought him a journal, a nice, little leather-bound journal, and the next day I brought it in, and I said, "Okay, your turn."
Oh.
And he would stay in at lunchtime, and he would read his romantics, and he would write tortured poetry, and then I think he did finally graduate, but it was touch and go. He was a bright kid, but he had a lot of trouble.
That is so
But
awesome that you
somehow
did that.
Isn't it cool, though, that of all the things that could reach out and touch a 15-year-old gang member,
Yeah.
it's Keats?
Yeah, you wouldn't think necessarily, right? But
I
that's
know.
great. That's really
That was
cool.
very
It
cool.
really gives me hope to hear things like that.
They come every once in a while when you're out teaching in places like New York. You get a few kids coming through who just surprise you one day.
Yeah.
And I think it's a testimony not to teachers necessarily as much as the quality of the literature.
Yeah.
That, if you feed them crap, they're getting crap. But if you're giving them the good stuff, there's a reason why it's the good stuff.
Yeah, definitely. And I definitely think my job as a teacher is in some ways just to kind of reveal, if it's not immediately
Mm-hmm.
obvious, how awesome this stuff is, and kind
Mm-hmm.
of let them go from there,
Yeah, because I think once they find that there's so many layers of things to get, and that every time they reread a poem or a text, they go, "Oh my God, I never saw that before."
Yeah.
Then it becomes a puzzle to put together or a
Right.
scavenger hunt or something much more interesting than, okay, read pages 39 to 80 tonight.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that is, I definitely agree. I think, with something, I think the romantics are not necessarily easy to read. They
No.
sometimes seem deceptively easy. Like this, to a skylark seems like it's just this nice little poem about a bird, right?
Yeah.
But once you actually, I mean, that's where like analysis comes in, right? Where you start to show
Yep.
them like it's not just a nice little poem about a bird. It's, showing all these, just probing these really important, deep questions about the human condition. I mean, it sounds lofty, but it's true. And getting them to sort of see that it totally relates to them, you know?
Yeah.
And they will,
Yeah, and it does.
oh yeah, yeah. They'll find that too, I think, if they're willing to find that.
Well, aside from the fact that Shelley and Keats were buddies and that they were both real hot and that they both died young and that they probably both spent quite a bit of time drinking and
Yeah.
playing around, and are both tortured souls. Um, one of the comments that you sent was that you saw a really good pairing between the Wordsworth and the Coleridge poem, and then also between Shelley's To a Skylark and Keats' Ode to a Nightingale.
Mm-hmm.
And where do you see the connections between those two poems?
Well, I think just that they are writing on a similar subject. They're both, addressing a bird, a skylark in Shelley's case and a nightingale in Keats's case, and they're kind of using the bird as an opportunity to meditate about, the limitations of human consciousness and the ways in which nature transcends that. And they both, again, they do express similar ideas in that they both are very aware that to be human is to be in pain, essentially. So Shelley says, we, meaning humans, our sincerest laughter with some pain is fraught. Our sweetest songs are those that tell of saddest thought. So, always with humans, even if we're laughing, we're crying, And the bird is not like that. The bird is transcendent. It's a blithe spirit. And Shelley really wants to learn from the bird. Like that's the refrain is teach us, teach me how you're so joyful, so transcendent, how you're so divine. And Keats wants the same thing, but I feel like in his poem, there's, again, as with Coleridge, there's much more of a recognition of that this will never happen. I'll never learn what, the secret is behind the nightingale's transcendence. He says he wants to fly away to the nightingale on the viewless wings of poesy, but he can't. And so by the end of the poem, he's, the music is gone, the vision is gone, and he's not going to get there, essentially. Whereas you get with Shelley, at least in this poem, he feels like maybe there's a possibility of getting there. So,
yeah, it's interesting because I've always thought of Shelley as being he's brooding, but he's not hopeless. And there's something even about like Ozymandias, which I think is one of the most damning poems of history and of certainly rulers in history as far as hubris goes, which is a word my 7-year-old already knows.
Woohoo, all right.
Yeah. He'll be watching the news with me and go, well, that's hubris.
Oh, that's
good boy. But there's even something, and maybe it's just the language that Shelley employs, but there's even something about Ozymandias, something about, I guess, somebody noticing that this happened.
Yeah.
And commenting on the irony that makes you think, well, the next time it won't happen like this. You won't get someone who's so full of himself that he thinks that he'll be able to make himself last forever by building some kind of monument.
Yeah. Yeah, the idea that we could learn from past mistakes, that we could learn from the skylark about how to be less, in pain, essentially.
Right. And I do, that there's, and I don't actually know what the final scholarship is. There's one of our listeners' sons just finished studying Frankenstein, and he was very, very adamant that we not use the revised Frankenstein that Mary Shelley revised years later, that we use the original because they changed the ending, evidently, which I didn't know.
I didn't know that either.
Yeah, so I'm going to have a conversation with him next week, but I know that there's a camp that believes that Percy wrote, or at least revised, much of Frankenstein, and I can see the argument for that because you certainly, every once in a while, the language just sounds like him. But then at the same time, she's married to the guy.
Yeah.
And all they do is talk about this stuff and write poetry. So I don't know if I buy that. I have a feeling that because her mom was
I don't know about that. And I don't know enough about the publication history of it or their relationship, and probably some of it is just not provable. But I'm very much into, women's studies. It's one of the things that I teach, but
Sure.
I bristle at the suggestion that
Mm-hmm.
that naturally, she had to have help from
Mm-hmm.
her husband, because it just
The
seems
little
like,
lady.
a claim that's been made throughout history to me.
Yep.
Um,
Well, and there are parts of Frankenstein that I've always felt a guy just couldn't have written.
mhm,
There's something about the way that Victor is written that requires more of an external view
mhm,
than someone who's on the inside.
yeah.
And I just think Frankenstein's brilliant, but
It is. I think really interestingly, my husband probably would not appreciate me saying this, although, but
we won't
we
tell him.
actually were going to listen to Frankenstein on CD recently in the car because we have a long commute together, and he just didn't like it. He was like, "Oh, you can, this is so romantic," essentially, and with a capital R. He
Right.
was like, "Oh, it's too internal. It's too, and he didn't say
Tortured.
feminine, but."
Right.
In a sense, that is what we
That's where
associate
he
with
was going.
femininity a lot of times, right? That femininity is associated with emotion and introspection and all of that stuff, and masculinity is
Absolutely.
reasonable and logical and all that stuff. Um,
Absolutely.
so, in that sense, it's a feminine kind of style.
And it's definitely a moon book.
Uh huh.
It's something it is of the night. It's impossible to think of Frankenstein and not picture the majority of it taking place with a full moon.
Mm-hmm. I can see that.
And I know the moon has been associated with women
Sure.
historically for many moons.
Sure.
There's also, I think, did your husband ever get past Walton's letters?
We did get to the point where Frankenstein was on board the ship and he starts telling the story of his youth and his relationship with Elizabeth and blah blah blah. And so yeah, but he had a real hard time with the
Yeah.
beginning. He was like, "What is
Those
this? He's
letters.
just writing to his sister. What's going on?"
Why is he going on and on about needing a friend?
Mhm.
I am anticipating that people are going to drop out of the podcast like rats leaving a sinking ship if I don't break into the narrative all through those going, it's almost over.
Yeah, I think you
It's
just have to
almost over.
set it up, and because it's not
Yeah.
necessarily what people expect when they go into Frankenstein. They're
No.
probably thinking, if they haven't read the book, they're not anticipating this frame narrative.
Yeah.
They're just thinking it's going to be the Frankenstein story, and
Yeah. Where's the monster?
yeah,
Get to the
exactly.
monster.
So he
And
does
it's true. There is
appear
no question.
not too long into it.
Yeah. No, and there is no question that the monster he's the reason that you read the book because he's not a monster.
Yeah,
Victor's the monster, and it's much more important to get the monsters, the creation's point of view.
right.
But that kind of brings us back to Keats, is that I've always seen a parallel between the monster and Keats.
Really?
That Keats is damaged goods for lots of reasons. He was sickly. He had a very difficult time. He always seemed to know he was going to die young.
Yeah.
And I've just seen kind of that same you know how when you're talking to someone who is terminally ill and they know they're going,
Yeah.
there is a different look in their eye.
Mm-hmm.
There is something about them that has made their peace with the universe on some level, whether they accept that they're going to go or are unhappy about it. There is an understanding that most of us just don't walk around with.
Mm-hmm.
And I always imagined it was in Keats, and I always picked it up from the monster.
Yeah.
That he knew he was created, and he knew that this was a limited thing.
Right.
And whether he was going to kill himself or drop dead after killing Victor, who knew?
Right.
But that they're both damaged goods.
That's really interesting. I never thought of that comparison, but it seems to work. I mean, in that sense, you could say that Keats and the monster are more fully human, more aware of what the human condition really is about than Frankenstein. I mean, Frankenstein, the whole novel is about his sort of recognition of his, hubris. And, but also I think his real limited understanding of what it really means to be human.
Yeah, he kind of has that Faustian outlook, like, well, in order to be human, I have to be God.
Yeah. And
And it's a mistake.
yeah, and whereas, in Ode to a Nightingale, Keats is so conscious of what it means, and but to think is to be full of sorrow. It's like, oh man.
Yeah.
And I think it says in my book that his brother Tom had died of tuberculosis the winter before he
Mhm.
wrote this. And so when he's thinking about youth growing pale and Spectre Thin and dying, he's thinking
It's his
about
brother.
that and potentially of his
That
own death as well.
Yeah. I do remember that about his brother now that you mention that, and that this came close to that time, which is, I mean, it's I think it's hard for us to remember how up until, what was it, 1937 or something like that, death was on your doorstep.
Mm,
If your child got the flu, it was, I mean, what was it? Something like 10%, 20%? It was huge
yeah,
of New York City was wiped out by the flu epidemic in the teens.
yeah, yeah,
That we were all much closer to death, both because people died at home as well as people died young and they died often.
yeah. Very
So
true.
it makes a lot of sense that this would have been on their minds, and yet in our modern view, a lot of these poems have come to be associated with tortured teenage poetry, and it's very hard to think of a teenager who gets everything at this level.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's really important to remember, and that's something that I always talk about in my Shakespeare classes because, they might think, well, why is Hamlet so freaking obsessed with death? Why is death so omnipresent in these plays? And it's like, well, during this period, the plague was a fact of life. It was something that people walked around with the consciousness of. We just don't have that. We're very fortunate. And in that light, I suppose you could say that, women in particular stood a good chance of dying in childbirth in previous
Yes.
centuries. And from that light, I know Frankenstein has often been looked at as a kind of fear of birth, or a kind of fear of the feminine capacity to birth. Um,
Right.
so in that light, I mean, you could totally look at it from that point of view.
Well, and did Mary Wollstonecraft die in childbirth or just when Mary Shelley was young?
I don't know about that actually.
I can't remember if it
I
was
don't
a
know
childbirth death or not.
when she died.
Boy, that would be interesting.
I feel like I should have that in my book, but I don't know if Wollstonecraft is in here. Um,
Yeah, I don't remember.
wait, she died in 1797. Actually, she was 40, so not
It's a little old.
young, but certainly not old. So
Yeah, Mary must have been a kid. And then of course there's the Mary Shelley and Keats, or Mary Shelley and Percy Shelley's very interesting getting together relationship, and Shelley's previous wife, and
right,
they had the inquest papers at the Shelley and Keats Museum. They had photostats of the original papers from England,
really,
where they brought him up from Italy to be at the inquest because his wife was found floating in the Thames, or his previous wife. I don't think
really.
they ever got officially divorced. I think he left, and she wound up face up. And there was some question as to whether he was directly responsible.
Hmm.
And they found not so much directly responsible, but they think that she was so depressed that he'd taken off that she jumped.
Right.
And then he hooked up. I think he'd already hooked up with Mary at that point.
Who was very young, right? I mean, a teenager.
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
you're
She was
right.
a kid.
You're right. She died. Mary Wollstonecraft died,
Uh-huh.
I think, giving birth to Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, because Shelley was
She was
born in
older.
1797 and Mary Wollstonecraft died in 1797. There you
Ah.
go.
Well, then that whole birth, the fear of birth thing, or the problems with birth thing, makes, and also the desire to be able to bestow life,
Mhm.
just as a theme, to be able to bring back the dead.
Right. No,
Makes a
you're
lot of
right.
sense.
Wollstonecraft died as a result of childbed fever incurred when she gave birth to Mary.
That was it.
And it also notes
Huh.
that when Shelley and Mary, hooked up, within a few months, Mary was pregnant. So and that she gave birth to a premature daughter who lived only a few weeks.
Oh,
So,
God.
yeah.
Horrible.
Yeah.
And of course, premature by a few weeks now is
Nothing.
doable.
Yeah, that's totally, yeah.
I mean, it's always scary, but at least it's plausible.
Yeah.
Ay, ay, ay. They did have a difficult time of it. It's important to remember that their kind of woe-begotten attitudes are in large part valid.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely. No, it's an important point, I think.
It's such interesting stuff.
Mhm.
One of the things that I used to do when I was teaching in New York City was to teach, I taught the greatest hits lines so that if we read Thoreau, I made sure that the kids knew Thoreauvian lines that people would toss around in casual conversation so that when they were out in the adult world, they'd be able to follow. I called it teaching by inside joke. If somebody's an adulterer and somebody says, well, she's nothing but a Hester Prynne,
Right.
the kids were going to get the joke.
Right.
So with Wordsworth, I know there's trailing clouds of glory in Intimations of Immortality, but are there any other greatest hit lines that you can think of that show up in any of these four poems that people should listen for?
Well, hail to thee, blithe spirit. And already with thee tender is the night from the Nightingale. And those are really, I guess, just because they gave their titles to other literary
other
works.
Books. Yeah. But they're good.
And the I guess thou wast not born for death, immortal bird, is one of those lines that kind of sticks out, as well as the splendor in the grass line.
Oh my gosh, that's right.
From the Immortality Ode. So
that's right.
That's the only ones I can think of.
And Elizabeth and I veered off into Shakespeare and King Lear and Merchant of Venice and all sorts of fabulous conversations, including the fact that Andy Minter is reading Lear in a LibriVox version. So we may have some King Lear in our future. But that's another conversation for another day. In the meantime, here we are going to have Ode to a Nightingale by John Keats and Ode to a Skylark by Percy Bysshe Shelley. I think I got that right. We're going to do Shelley first, and we're going to end with Keats. Here we go.
Ode to a Skylark. Ode to a Skylark by Percy Bysshe Shelley, 1792 to 1822, is usually assigned to grammar grades of schools. It is included here out of respect to a boy of 11 years who was more impressed with these lines than with any other lines in any poem. Hail to thee, blithe spirit, bird thou never wert, that from heaven or near it pourest thy full heart in profuse strains of unpremeditated art. Higher still and higher from the earth thou springest, like a cloud of fire, the blue deep thou wingest, and singing still dost soar, and soaring ever singest. In the golden lightning of the sunken sun, o'er which clouds are brightening, thou dost float and run, like an unbodied joy, whose race is just begun. The pale purple even melts around thy flight, like a star of heaven in the broad daylight. Thou art unseen, but yet I hear thy shrill delight. All the earth and air with thy voice is loud, as, when night is bare, from one lonely cloud the moon rains out her beams, and heaven is overflowed. What thou art we know not, what is most like thee. From rainbow clouds there flow not drops so bright to see as from thy presence showers a rain of melody. Like a poet hidden in the light of thought, singing hymns unbidden till the world is wrought to sympathy with hopes and fears it heeded not. Teach us, sprite or bird, what sweet thoughts are thine. I have never heard praise of love or wine that panted forth a flood of rapture so divine. Chorus hymeneal or triumphal chant, matched with thine, would be all but an empty vaunt. a thing wherein we feel there is some hidden want. What objects are the fountains of thy happy strain? What fields or waves or mountains? What shapes of sky or plain? What love of thine own kind? What ignorance of pain? Teach me half the gladness that thy brain must know. Such harmonious madness from my lips would flow. The world should listen then, as I am listening now. Percy Bysshe Shelley.
All right, so there is Skylark, and now we switch to Keats and the Nightingale. And remember, this was written after his younger brother died.
Ode to a Nightingale by John Keats. Read for LibriVox.org by Jason Oakley. Brisbane, Australia. www.bangrocks.com. My heart aches and a drowsy numbness pains my sense as though of hemlock I had drunk, or emptied some dull opiate to the drains. 1 minute past and leathwards had sunk. 'Tis not through envy of thy happy lot, but being too happy in thine happiness, that thou, light-winged dryad of the trees, in some melodious plot of beech and green and shadows numberless, singest of summer in full-throated ease. Oh, for a draught of vintage that thou had been cooled a long age in the deep-delved earth, tasting of flora and the country green, dance and Provençal song and sunburnt myth. Oh, for a beaker full of the warm south, full of the true, the blushful Hippocrene, with beaded bubbles winking at the brim and purple-stained mouth, that I might drink and leave the world unseen, and with thee fade away into the forest dim. Fade far away, dissolve, and quite forget what thou among the leaves hast never known, the weariness, the fever, and the fret, here where men sit and hear each other groan, where palsy shakes a few sad last grey hairs, where youth grows pale and spectre thin and dies, where but to think is to be full of sorrow and leaden eye despairs, where beauty cannot keep her lustrous eyes, or new love pine at them beyond tomorrow. Away, away, for I will fly to thee, not charioted by Bacchus and his pards, but on the viewless wings of poesy, through the dull-brained perplexers and retards, already with thee, tender as the night, and haply the queen moon is on her throne, clustered around by all her starry fays, but here there is no light, save from what heaven is with the breezes blown, through verdurous glooms and winding mossy ways. I cannot see what flowers are at my feet, nor what soft incense hangs upon the boughs, but in embalmed darkness guess each sweet, wherewith the seasonable month endows, the grass, the thicket, and the fruit tree wild, white hawthorn, and the pastoral eglantine, fast fading violets covered up in leaves, and mid-May's eldest child, the coming musk rose full of dewy wine, the murmurous haunt of flies on summer eves. Darkling I listen, and for many a time I have been half in love with easeful death, called him soft names in many a mused rhyme, to take into the air my quiet breath. Now more than ever seems it writ to die, to cease upon the midnight with no pain, while thou art pouring forth thy soul abroad in such an ecstasy. Still wouldst thou sing, and I have ears in vain to thy high requiem become a sod. Thou wast not born for death, immortal bird. No hungry generations tread thee down. The voice I hear this passing night was heard in ancient days by emperor and clown. Perhaps the self-same song that found a path through the sad heart of Ruth when, sick for home, she stood in tears amid the alien corn. The same that oft-time hath charmed magic casements, opening on the foam of perilous seas in fairy lands forlorn. Forlorn, the very word is like a bell to toil me back from thee to my soul's self. Adieu, the fancy cannot cheat so well as she is famed to do, deceiving elf. Adieu, adieu, thy plaintive anthem fades past the near meadows, over the still stream, up the hillside, and now 'tis buried deep in the valley glades. Was it a vision or a waking dream? Fled is that music, do I wake or sleep?
All right, don't freak out if you didn't understand all of the poems. You may want to go back and listen to them again because they do kind of stand up to that kind of scrutiny. Um, we are going to be talking more and more about the romantics and what it means to be called a romantic between now and, well, the end of Frankenstein, because it really does kind of matter that you have a very clear picture of who these people were and what kinds of themes they tended to write on and how they tended to write. So, this is our first step into the larger Frankensteinian world, and I hope you've enjoyed it. I certainly had a wonderful time chatting with Elizabeth and had to cut out a good 20 minutes of our conversation because it really would have been probably boring to you, but it was fascinating to us. Um, I have produced 2 podcasts this week, and I am now going to go to sleep. I'll talk to you later. Have a great week. Welcome to CraftLit, the podcast for crafters who like books. My name is Heather Wardover, and I'm podcasting from my corner of the Sonoran Desert, the Old Pueblo, Tucson, Arizona. Episode 76, Back in the Saddle. Hello, I have a voice again. And I've actually been recording all week long on my little digital audio recorder because my voice won't actually last very long. I can get about, 10 or 20 minutes of decent speaking time before I either start to cough uncontrollably for 20 or 40 minutes, or before I start to sound like what you heard me sound like earlier on to Frankenstein. I am going to be interviewing Deb Greenberger's son. You've already heard from her daughter, Kate. We are now going to hear from Deb's son, Robbie. And at some point, I'm going to interview all of Deb's family, I've decided, because they're clearly really interesting people who know a lot. But while I work my way through the family, Robbie's going to be our next one. He's the one who recently read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein in a class and knew some stuff that I didn't know, or at least I forgot if I ever did know, about Mary Shelley and about Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein. I recorded my first set of notes to the text on my handheld digital recorder, and I did it because I wasn't able to get in here into my studio, which is the study, earlier, because my husband and I have been working on NaNoWriMo, which is the National Novel Writing Month competition. My husband, I think, is actually going to make it. I am not. I have petered out. I don't have a plot. I had some characters. And I'm starting to think of a new plot, and I may just keep writing, kind of pick up and run and ignore the first couple thousand pages. I wrote 5,000 words, but it's a 50,000 word book that we're supposed to write. And if I continue at the pace that I'm going right now, that won't happen. So I think I'm going to switch plots. My husband has a plot, but he thinks he's going to finish early, so he's going to write a second book, I think. It's just the way he is. He's such an overachiever. At least when it comes to writing, he is. So, I have not been able to be in here, so I'm going to switch audio tracks for a moment, and I'm sure the audio quality is going to go down a bit, but you should still be able to hear just fine as I introduce the first book in our new novel. I'm so excited, of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus. Okay, me again. I just listened to the beginning of the audio, and this is only 2 days ago. And you will hear not only the change in sound quality, but you will hear how sick I sound.
this is what I will sound like in another 10 minutes. We have about a half hour of audio to listen to today, and it's going to be a little frustrating for some of you who aren't familiar with the structure of Frankenstein. Mary Shelley employed a construct of diegetic levels, which is kind of a Pomo way of saying she has a story within a story within a story. First, we have a man named Walton who is on the ocean traveling, and he is the one who sets up our tale. He's the one who gets us started on what it means to have this be a romantic story. And again, that's capital R romantic, not lowercase r, oh, I love you and thank you for the Hallmark card romantic. To give you an idea of what that means, Walton is going to be sending his sister a series of letters. There are 4 letters, and the 4th one is broken up into pieces. I'm going to break in between all of the letters and kind of give you a heads up or talk to you about what happened in the previous one. But to get you started before this first letter is read, you are going to hear Mary Shelley tell you through the voice of Walton everything you need to know about what it means to be a romantic. Again, capital R romantic. This is not necessarily what you think of when you think of romances, although you will see some interesting parallels to the romance of Tristan and Isolde, kind of the suffering nature that you saw in that book. Romance in our current novel includes nature big time, kind of the undiscovered solitude. These are actually words that you're going to hear Walton talking about. The romance of nature, the undiscovered solitude, the wondrous power that attracts the needle as you go further and further north. All of this kind of elevated language is also the way that the Romantics thought of nature. Again, this is in reaction to the Enlightenment. These are very intelligent, very educated people who felt that a constant attachment to and a almost religious devotion to science and logic and fact was missing a whole chunk of the importance of life, and that the important parts that were being left out were an appreciation for and a respect for nature and the natural world. And that included the supernatural and the supernatural world. And there'll be more on that to come. They weren't necessarily religious in any particular denominational sense, although I'm sure if they were pushed, most of them were at least raised Christian, if not continuing to believe in kind of the basic tenets of Christianity. But I think the more hardcore of the Romantics really did kind of give over to almost a druidic aspect in their attitude towards nature and looking at nature as a religious kind of a tenet. There's something else that Walton says that is particularly romantic, which is that poets influenced him. And the way he talks about it, you can hear that he's clearly someone who has money. He's clearly someone who had the time and the opportunity to devote himself to poets and poetry. However, and this is important, in our modern world, if we met a guy who said, well, I've completely given myself over to poetry, we would have a rather stereotyped vision in mind of who this man was. He would probably not be someone who could bench press 150, much less 300. He would probably have glasses. He would probably be a little effeminate, a little weak. These are our modern prejudices. These are not the Romantics. Shelley went off and fought in war in Greece. Byron did the same thing. You know, these were tough guys who lived large. Keats was probably the weakest of all of them and probably the most stereotypical in our perception of what a poet is or was. But Byron was hot and Shelley was hot, and these guys were hot and tough and smart. So when Walton says that he had given himself over to poetry, he also shortly thereafter talks about having consigned himself to a whaling ship. And I would for a moment like you to think back and remember what that actually meant. If you've ever looked at any pictures of sketches or drawings that accompanied Moby Dick, or any paintings that go along with whaling in the 17 and 1800s, I think it will be brought back to your mind just how brutal a job that was and how much brute strength it required to work a whaler. And this is something that Walton did for a considerable chunk of time. So that is our introduction to this beginning of the romantic novel and the first letter that Walton writes to his sister in the novel Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus by Mary Shelley.
Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus by Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. The Letters. Letter 1. To Mrs. Saville, England, St. Petersburg, December 11th, sometime in the 1700s. You will rejoice to hear that no disaster has accompanied the commencement of an enterprise which you have regarded with such evil forebodings. I arrived here yesterday, and my first task is to assure my dear sister of my welfare and increasing confidence in the success of my undertaking. I am already far north of London, and as I walk in the streets of Petersburg, I feel a cold northern breeze play upon my cheeks, which braces my nerves and fills me with delight. Do you understand this feeling? This breeze, which has traveled from the regions towards which I am advancing, gives me a foretaste of those icy climes. Inspirited by this wind of promise, my daydreams become more fervent and vivid. I try in vain to be persuaded that the pole is the seat of frost and desolation. It ever presents itself to my imagination as the region of beauty and delight. There, Margaret, the sun is forever visible, its broad disk just skirting the horizon and diffusing a perpetual splendor. There, for with your leave, my sister, I will put some trust in preceding navigators. There, snow and frost are banished, and sailing over a calm sea, we may be wafted to a land surpassing in wonders and in beauty every region hitherto discovered on the habitable globe. Its productions and features may be without example, as the phenomena of the heavenly bodies undoubtedly are in those undiscovered solitudes. What may not be expected in a country of eternal light? I may there discover the wondrous power which attracts the needle, and may regulate 1,000 celestial observations that require only this voyage to render their seeming eccentricities consistent forever. I shall satiate my ardent curiosity with the sight of a part of the world never before visited, and may tread a land never before imprinted by the foot of man. These are my enticements, and they are sufficient to conquer all fear of danger or death, and to induce me to commence this laborious voyage with the joy a child feels when he embarks in a little boat with his holiday mates on an expedition of discovery up his native river. But supposing all these conjectures to be false, you cannot contest the inestimable benefit which I shall confer on all mankind, to the last generation, by discovering a passage near the pole to those countries, to reach which, at present, so many months are requisite, or by ascertaining the secret of the magnet, which, if at all possible, can only be effected by an undertaking such as mine. These reflections have dispelled the agitation with which I began my letter, and I feel my heart glow with an enthusiasm which elevates me to heaven, for nothing contributes so much to tranquilize the mind as a steady purpose, a point on which the soul may fix its intellectual eye. This expedition has been the favorite dream of my early years. I have read with ardor the accounts of the various voyages which have been made in the prospect of arriving at the North Pacific Ocean through the seas which surround the pole. You may remember that a history of all the voyages made for purposes of discovery composed the whole of our good Uncle Thomas's library. My education was neglected, yet I was passionately fond of reading. These volumes were my study day and night, and my familiarity with them increased that regret which I had felt as a child on learning that my father's dying injunction had forbidden my uncle to allow me to embark in a seafaring life. These visions faded when I perused, for the first time, those poets whose effusions entranced my soul and lifted it to heaven. I also became a poet, and for 1 year lived in a paradise of my own creation. I imagined that I also might obtain a niche in the temple where the names of Homer and Shakespeare are consecrated. You are well acquainted with my failure, and how I heavily bore the disappointment. But just at that time I inherited the fortune of my cousin, and my thoughts were turned into the channel of their earlier bent. 6 years have passed since I resolved on my present undertaking. I can, even now, remember the hour from which I dedicated myself to this great enterprise. I commenced by inuring my body to hardship. I accompanied the whale fishers on several expeditions to the North Sea. I voluntarily endured cold, famine, thirst, and want of sleep. I often worked harder than the common sailors during the day, and devoted my nights to the study of mathematics, the theory of medicine, and those branches of physical science from which a naval adventurer might derive the greatest practical advantage. Twice, I actually hired myself as an undermate in a Greenland whaler, and acquitted myself to admiration. I must own I felt a little proud when my captain offered me the second dignity in the vessel, and entreated me to remain with the greatest earnestness, so valuable did he consider my services. And now, dear Margaret, do I not deserve to accomplish some great purpose? My life might have been passed in ease and luxury, but I preferred glory to every enticement that wealth placed in my path. Oh, that some encouraging voice would answer in the affirmative. My courage and my resolution is firm, but my hopes fluctuate, and my spirits are often depressed. I am about to proceed on a long and difficult voyage, the emergencies of which will demand all my fortitude. I am required not only to raise the spirits of others, but sometimes to sustain my own, when theirs are failing. This is the most favorable period for traveling in Russia. They fly quickly over the snow in their sledges. The motion is pleasant, and in my opinion far more agreeable than that of an English stagecoach. The cold is not excessive, if you are wrapped in furs, a dress which I have already adopted, for there is a great difference between walking the deck and remaining seated motionless for hours, when no exercise prevents the blood from actually freezing in your veins. I have no ambition to lose my life on that post road between St. Petersburg and Archangel. I shall depart for the latter town in a fortnight or 3 weeks, and my intention is to hire a ship there, which can easily be done by paying the insurance for the owner, and to engage as many sailors as I think necessary among those who are accustomed to the whale fishing. I do not intend to sail until the month of June. And when shall I return? Ah, dear sister, how can I answer this question? If I succeed, many, many months, perhaps years, will pass before you and I may meet. If I fail, you will see me again soon, or never. Farewell, my dear, excellent Margaret. Heaven shower down blessings on you and save me, that I may again and again testify my gratitude for all your love and kindness. Your affectionate brother, R. Walton.
All right, so he's not the greatest reader in the world, but he's not bad, and he actually gets most of the important stuff. Letter 2 is coming up, and I pre-recorded some audio on letter 2 because while that one was playing, I've been coughing the whole time. So here we go with my pre-recording. All right, so for our second letter, Walton is going to tell you about his deepest heart's desire, and it's not what you think it is. And this is, again, a very romantic ideal. Certainly something that all of the romantics were after, and one of the reasons why they stuck with each other so much. And Walton even says, and this is Mary Shelley and probably Percy speaking through Walton, saying, "You may deem me romantic." He also gets into kind of a poetic mind later on in the letter and says, "I shall kill no albatross." Well, this is a direct link to the poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which was written by Coleridge. He doesn't mention Coleridge by name, but he does refer to that most imaginative of modern poets, and that is, in fact, Coleridge. And that's Mary Shelley giving a little nod to Coleridge, he was part of the Romantic movement, but he was not part of that central trio, the Shelley, Keats, and Byron. The next letter after this is very short, and I'm not going to comment on it, but I will comment after the third letter.
Letter 2. To Mrs. Saville, England. Archangel, 28th March, sometime in the 1700s. How slowly the time passes here, encompassed as I am by frost and snow, yet a second step is taken toward my enterprise. I have hired a vessel, and am occupied in collecting my sailors. Those whom I have already engaged appear to be men on whom I can depend, and are certainly possessed of dauntless courage. But I have one want, which I have never yet been able to satisfy, and the absence of the object of which I now feel as a most severe evil. I have no friend, Margaret. When I am glowing with the enthusiasm of success, there will be none to participate my joy. If I am assailed by disappointment, no one will endeavor to sustain me in dejection. I shall commit my thoughts to paper, it is true, but that is a poor medium for the communication of feeling. I desire the company of a man who could sympathize with me, whose eyes would reply to mine. You may deem me romantic, my dear sister, but I bitterly feel the want of a friend. I have no one near me, gentle yet courageous, possessed of a cultivated as well as of a capacious mind, whose tastes are like my own, to approve or amend my plans. How would such a friend repair the faults of your poor brother? I am too ardent in execution and too impatient of difficulties. But it is a still greater evil to me that I am self-educated. For the first 14 years of my life, I ran wild on a common, and read nothing but our Uncle Thomas's books of voyages. At that age, I became acquainted with the celebrated poets of our own country, but it was only when it had ceased to be in my power to derive its most important benefits from such a conviction that I perceived the necessity of becoming acquainted with more languages than that of my native country. Now I am 28, and in reality more illiterate than many schoolboys of 15. It is true that I have thought more, and my daydreams are more extended and magnificent, but they want, as the painters call it, keeping. And I greatly need a friend who would have sense enough not to despise me as a romantic, and affection enough for me to endeavor to regulate my mind. Well, these are useless complaints. I shall surely find no friend on the wide ocean, nor even here an archangel among merchants and seamen. Yet some feelings, unallied to the dross of human nature, beat even in these rugged bosoms. My lieutenant, for instance, is a man of wonderful courage and enterprise. He is madly desirous of glory, or rather, to word my phrase more characteristically, of advancement in his profession. He is an Englishman, and in the midst of national and professional prejudices, unsoftened by cultivation, retains some of the noblest endowments of humanity. I first became acquainted with him on board a whale vessel. Finding that he was unemployed in this city, I easily engaged him to assist in my enterprise. The master is a person of excellent disposition and is remarkable in the ship for his gentleness and the mildness of his discipline. This circumstance, added to his well-known integrity and dauntless courage, made me very desirous to engage him. A youth passed in solitude, my best years spent under your gentle and feminine fosterage, has so refined the groundwork of my character that I cannot overcome an intense distaste to the usual brutality exercised on board ship. I have never believed it to be necessary, and when I heard of a mariner, equally noted for his kindliness of heart and the respect and obedience paid to him by his crew, I felt myself peculiarly fortunate in being able to secure his services. I heard of him first in rather a romantic manner, from a lady who owes to him the happiness of her life. This, briefly, is his story. Some years ago he loved a young Russian lady of moderate fortune, and having amassed a considerable sum in prize money, the father of the girl consented to the match. He saw his mistress once before the destined ceremony, but she was bathed in tears and throwing herself at his feet, entreated him to spare her, confessing at the same time that she loved another, but that he was poor and that her father would never consent to the union. My generous friend reassured the suppliant, and on being informed of the name of her lover, instantly abandoned his pursuit. He had already bought a farm with his money, on which he had designed to pass the remainder of his life, but he bestowed the whole on his rival, together with the remains of his prize money to purchase stock, and then himself solicited the young woman's father to consent to her marriage with her lover. But the old man decidedly refused, thinking himself bound in honor to my friend, who, when he found the father inexorable, quitted his country, nor returned until he heard that his former mistress was married according to her inclinations. What a noble fellow, you will exclaim. He is so, but then he is wholly uneducated. He is as silent as a Turk, and a kind of ignorant carelessness attends him, which, while it renders his conduct the more astonishing, detracts from the interest and sympathy which otherwise he would command. Yet do not suppose, because I complain a little, or because I can conceive a consolation for my toils, which I may never know, that I am wavering in my resolutions. Those are as fixed as fate, and my voyage is only now delayed until the weather shall permit my embarkation. The winter has been dreadfully severe, but the spring promises well, and it is considered as a remarkably early season, so that perhaps I may sail sooner than I expected. I shall do nothing rashly. You know me sufficiently to confide in my prudence and considerateness whenever the safety of others is committed to my care. I cannot describe to you my sensations on the near prospect of my undertaking. It is impossible to communicate to you a conception of the trembling sensation, half pleasurable and half fearful, with which I am preparing to depart. I am going to unexplored regions, to the land of mist and snow, but I shall kill no albatross. Therefore do not be alarmed for my safety, or if I should come back to you as worn and woeful as the ancient mariner. You will smile at my illusion, but I will disclose a secret. I have often attributed my attachment to, my passion and enthusiasm for, the dangerous mysteries of ocean to that production of the most imaginative of modern poets. There is something at work in my soul which I do not understand. I am practically industrious, painstaking, a workman to execute with perseverance and labor, but besides this there is a love for the marvelous, a belief in the marvelous, intertwined in all my projects, which hurries me out of the common pathways of men, even to the wild sea and unvisited regions I am about to explore. But to return to dearer considerations, shall I meet you again, after having traversed immense seas and returned by most southern cape of Africa or America? I dare not expect such success, yet I cannot bear to look on the reverse of the picture. Continue for the present to write to me by every opportunity. I may receive your letters on some occasions when I need them most to support my spirits. I love you very tenderly. Remember me with affection should you never hear from me again. Your affectionate brother, Robert Walton. Letter 3. To Mrs. Saville, England, July 7th, sometime in the 1700s. My dear sister, I write a few lines in haste to say that I am safe and well advanced on my voyage. This letter will reach England by a merchantman now on its homeward voyage from Archangel, more fortunate than I, who may not see my native land perhaps for many years. I am, however, in good spirits. My men are bold and apparently firm of purpose, nor do the floating sheets of ice that continually pass us, indicating the dangers of the region toward which we are advancing, appear to dismay them. We have already reached a very high latitude, but it is the height of summer, and although not so warm as in England, the southern gales which blow us speedily towards those shores which I so ardently desire to attain breathe a degree of renovating warmth which I had not expected. No incidents have hitherto befallen us that would make a figure in a letter. One or two stiff gales and the springing of a leak are accidents which experienced navigators scarcely remember to record, and I shall be well content if nothing worse happened to us during our voyage. Adieu, my dear Margaret. Be assured that for my own sake, as well as yours, I will not rashly encounter danger. I will be cool, persevering, and prudent. But success shall crown my endeavors. Wherefore not? Thus far I have gone, tracing a secure way over the pathless seas, the very stars themselves being witnesses and testimonies of my triumph. Why not still proceed over the untamed yet obedient element? What can stop the determined heart and resolved will of man? My swelling heart involuntarily pours itself out thus. But I must finish. Heaven bless my beloved sister. R.W.
All right, and here's my pre-recorded commentary on letter 4. This is where it gets good. All right, letter 4. Now you finally get the good part. Now you'll understand why. Well, you'll understand part of why all of this had to happen this way. Why Shelley had to start with Walton and create a reason for us hearing Victor's story. And this is where you will finally start to get an inkling of what's coming. This is the fun part, or the beginning of the fun part, anyway. All right, I'm going to shut up so that you can listen. Here you go.
Letter 4. To Mrs. Saville, England, August 5th, sometime in the 1700s. So strange an accident has happened to us that I cannot forbear recording it, although it is very probable that you will see me before these papers can come into your possession. Last Monday, July 31st, we were nearly surrounded by ice, which closed in the ship on all sides, scarcely leaving the sea room in which she floated. Our situation was somewhat dangerous, especially as we were compassed round by a very thick fog. We accordingly lay to, hoping that some change would take place in the atmosphere and weather. About 2 o'clock the mist cleared away, and we beheld, stretched out in every direction, vast and irregular plains of ice, which seemed to have no end. Some of my comrades groaned, and my own mind began to grow watchful with anxious thoughts, when a strange sight suddenly attracted our attention and diverted our solicitude from our situation. We perceived a low carriage, fixed on a sledge and drawn by dogs, pass on towards the north. At the distance of half a mile, a being which had the shape of a man, but apparently of gigantic stature, sat in the sledge and guided the dogs. We watched the rapid progress of the traveler with our telescopes until he was lost among the distant inequalities of the ice. This appearance excited our unqualified wonder. We were, as we believed, many hundred miles from any land, but this apparition seemed to denote that it was not, in reality, so distant as we had supposed. Shut in, however, by ice, it was impossible to follow his track, which we had observed with the greatest attention. About 2 hours after this occurrence, we heard the ground sea, and before night the ice broke and freed our ship. We, however, lay to until the morning, fearing to encounter in the dark those large, loose masses which float about after the breaking up of ice. I profited of this time to rest for a few hours. In the morning, however, as soon as it was light, I went upon deck and found all the sailors busy on one side of the vessel, apparently talking to someone in the seas. It was, in fact, a sledge, like that which we had seen before, which had drifted towards us in the night on a large fragment of ice. Only one dog remained alive, but there was a human being within it whom the sailors were persuading to enter the vessel. He was not, as the other travelers seemed to be, a savage inhabitant of some undiscovered island, but a European. When I appeared on deck, the master said, "Here is our captain, and he will not allow you to perish on the open sea." On perceiving me, the stranger addressed me in English, although with a foreign accent. "Before I come on board your vessel," said he, "will you have the kindness to inform me whither you are bound?" Well, you may conceive my astonishment on hearing such a question addressed to me from a man on the brink of destruction, and to whom I should have supposed that my vessel would have been a resource which he would not have exchanged for the most precious wealth the earth can afford. I replied, however, that we were on a voyage of discovery toward the northern pole. Upon hearing this, he appeared satisfied and consented to come on board. Good God, Margaret, if you had seen the man who thus capitulated for his safety, your surprise would have been boundless. His limbs were nearly frozen, and his body dreadfully emaciated by fatigue and suffering. I never saw a man in so wretched a condition. We attempted to carry him into the cabin, but as soon as he had quitted the fresh air, he fainted. We accordingly brought him back to the deck, and restored him to animation by rubbing him with brandy and forcing him to swallow a small quantity. As soon as he showed signs of life, we wrapped him up in blankets and placed him near the chimney of the kitchen stove. By slow degrees he recovered and ate a little soup, which restored him wonderfully. 2 days passed in this manner before he was able to speak, and I often feared that his sufferings had deprived him of understanding. When he had in some measure recovered, I removed him to my own cabin and attended on him as much as my duty would permit. I never saw a more interesting creature. His eyes have generally an expression of wildness and even madness, but there are moments when, if anyone performs an act of kindness towards him, or does him the most trifling service, his whole countenance is lighted up, as it were, with a beam of benevolence and sweetness that I never saw equaled. But he is generally melancholy and despairing, and sometimes he gnashes his teeth, as if impatient of the weight of woes that oppresses him. When my guest was a little recovered, I had great trouble to keep off the men who wished to ask him 1,000 questions, but I would not allow him to be tormented by their idle curiosity, in a state of body and mind whose restoration evidently depended upon entire repose. Once, however, the lieutenant asked why he had come so far upon the ice in so strange a vehicle. His countenance instantly assumed an aspect of deepest gloom, and he replied, "To seek one who fled from me." "And did the man whom you pursued travel in the same fashion?" "Yes." "Then I fancy we have seen him, for the day before we picked you up we saw some dogs drawing a sledge with a man in it across the ice." This aroused the stranger's attention, and he asked a multitude of questions concerning the route which the demon, as he called him, had pursued. Soon after, when he was alone with me, he said, "I have doubtless excited your curiosity, as well as that of these good people, but you are too considerate to make inquiries." "Certainly, it would indeed be very impertinent and inhuman in me to trouble you with any inquisitiveness of mine." "And yet you rescued me from a strange and perilous situation. You have benevolently restored me to life." Soon after this he inquired if I thought that the breaking up of the ice had destroyed the other sledge. I replied that I could not answer with any degree of certainty, for the ice had not broken until near midnight, and the traveler might have arrived at a place of safety before that time, but of this I could not judge. From this time a new spirit of life animated the decaying frame of the stranger. He manifested the greatest eagerness to be upon deck to watch for the sledge, which had before appeared, but I have persuaded him to remain in the cabin, for he is far too weak to sustain the rawness of the atmosphere. I have promised that someone should watch for him, and give him instant notice if any new object should appear in sight. Such is my journal of what relates to this strange occurrence up to the present day. The stranger has gradually improved in health, but is very silent and appears uneasy when anyone except myself enters his cabin. Yet his manners are so conciliating and gentle that the sailors are all interested in him, although they have had very little communication with him. For my own part, I begin to love him as a brother, and his constant and deep grief fills me with sympathy and compassion. He must have been a noble creature in his better days, being even now in wreck so attractive and amiable. I said in one of my letters, my dear Margaret, that I should find no friend on the wide ocean. Yet I have found a man who, before his spirit had been broken by misery, I should have been happy to have possessed as the brother of my heart. I shall continue my journal concerning the stranger at intervals, should I have any fresh incidents to record. August 13th, sometime in the 1700s. My affection for my guest increases every day. He excites at once my admiration and my pity to an astonishing degree. How can I see so noble a creature destroyed by misery without feeling the most poignant grief? He is so gentle, yet so wise. His mind is so cultivated, and when he speaks, although his words are culled with the choicest art, yet they flow with rapidity and unparalleled eloquence. He is now much recovered from his illness, and is continually on the deck, apparently watching for the sledge that preceded his own. Yet, although unhappy, he is not so utterly occupied by his own misery, but that he interests himself deeply in the projects of others. He has frequently conversed with me on mine, which I have communicated to him without disguise. He entered attentively into all my arguments in favor of my eventual success, and into every minute detail of the measures I had taken to secure it. I was easily led by the sympathy which he evinced to use the language of my heart, to give utterance to the burning ardor of my soul, and to say, with all the fervor that warmed me, how gladly I would sacrifice my fortune, my existence, my every hope, to the furtherance of my enterprise. One man's life or death were but a small price to pay for the acquirement of the knowledge which I sought, for the dominion I should acquire and transmit over the elemental foes of our race. As I spoke, a dark gloom spread over my listener's countenance. At first, I perceived that he tried to suppress his emotion. He placed his hands before his eyes, and my voice quivered and failed me as I beheld tears trickle fast from beneath his fingers. A groan burst from his heaving breast. I paused. At length he spoke in broken accents. "Unhappy man, do you share my madness? Have you drunk also of the intoxicating draught? Hear me, let me reveal my tale, and you will dash the cup from your lips." Such words, you may imagine, strongly excited my curiosity. But the paroxysm of grief that had seized the stranger overcame his weakened powers, and many hours of repose and tranquil conversation were necessary to restore his composure. Having conquered the violence of his feelings, he appeared to despise himself for being the slave of passion, and quelling the dark tyranny of despair, he led me again to converse concerning myself personally. He asked me the history of my earlier years. The tale was quickly told, but it awakened various trains of reflection. I spoke of my desire of finding a friend, of my thirst for a more intimate sympathy with a fellow mind than had ever fallen to my lot, and expressed my conviction that a man could boast of little happiness who did not enjoy this blessing. "I agree with you," replied the stranger. "We are unfashioned creatures, but half made up, if one wiser, better, dearer than ourselves. Such a friend ought to be. Do not lend his aid to perfectionate our weak and faulty natures. I once had a friend, the most noble of human creatures, and am entitled, therefore, to judge respecting friendship. You have hope, and the world before you, and have no cause for despair, but I have lost everything, and cannot begin life anew." As he said this, his countenance became expressive of a calm, settled grief that touched me to the heart. But he was silent, and presently retired to his cabin. Even broken in spirit as he is, no one can feel more deeply than he does the beauties of nature. The starry sky, the sea, and every sight afforded by these wonderful regions seems still to have the power of elevating his soul from earth. Such a man has a double existence. He may suffer misery and be overwhelmed by disappointments. Yet, when he has retired into himself, he will be like a celestial spirit that has a halo around him, within whose circle no grief or folly ventures. Will you smile at the enthusiasm I express concerning this divine wanderer? You would not if you saw him. You have been tutored and refined by books and retirement from the world, and you are therefore somewhat fastidious. But this only renders you the more fit to appreciate the extraordinary merits of this wonderful man. Sometimes I have endeavored to discover what quality it is which he possesses that elevates him so immeasurably above any other person I ever knew. I believe it to be an intuitive discernment, a quick but never failing power of judgment, a penetration into the causes of things, unequaled for clearness and precision. Add to this a facility of expression and a voice whose varied intonations are soul-subduing music. August 19th, sometime in the 1700s. Yesterday the stranger said to me, "You may easily perceive, Captain Walton, that I have suffered great and unparalleled misfortunes. I had determined at one time that the memory of these evils should die with me, but you have won me to alter my determination. You seek for knowledge and wisdom, as I once did, and I ardently hope that the gratification of your wishes may not be a serpent to sting you, as mine has been. I do not know that the relation of my disasters will be useful to you, yet when I reflect that you are pursuing the same course, exposing yourself to the same dangers which have rendered me what I am, I imagine that you may deduce an apt moral from my tale, one that may direct you, if you succeed in your undertaking, and console you in case of failure. Prepare to hear of occurrences which are usually deemed marvelous. Were we among the tamer scenes of nature, I might fear to encounter your unbelief, perhaps your ridicule. But many things will appear possible in these wild and mysterious regions which would provoke the laughter of those unacquainted with the ever-varied powers of nature. Nor can I doubt but that my tale conveys in its series internal evidence of the truth of the events of which it is composed. You may easily imagine that I was much gratified by the offered communication, yet I could not endure that he should renew his grief by a recital of his misfortunes. I felt the greatest eagerness to hear the promised narrative, partly from curiosity, and partly from a strong desire to ameliorate his fate if it were in my power. I expressed these feelings in my answer. "I thank you," he replied, "for your sympathy, but it is useless. My fate is nearly fulfilled. I wait but for one event, and then I shall repose in peace. I understand your feeling," continued he, perceiving that I wished to interrupt him, "but you are mistaken, my friend, if thus you will allow me to name you. Nothing can alter my destiny. Listen to my history, and you will perceive how irrevocably it is determined." He then told me that he would commence his narrative the next day when I should be at leisure. This promise drew from me the warmest thanks. I have resolved every night, when I am not imperatively occupied by my duties, to record, as nearly as possible in his own words, what he has related during the day. If I should be engaged, I will at least make notes. This manuscript will doubtless afford you the greatest pleasure, but to me, who know him, and who hear it from his own lips, with what interest and sympathy shall I read it in some future day? Even now, as I commence my task, his full-toned voice swells in my ears. His lustrous eyes dwell on me with all their melancholy sweetness. I see his thin hand raised in animation, while the lineaments of his face are irradiated by the soul within. Strange and harrowing must be his story. Frightful the storm which embraced the gallant vessel on its course and wrecked it thus. End of the letters.
All right, so that was a fairly obvious way to deal with exposition. We now know who Victor is. We know that something horrible happened. We know that he's chasing some monstrous and huge being. And now we know that we are going to find out what Victor's past has entailed. And that is now what we're going to do. We're going to go backwards in time, and Victor is going to tell his story to Walton. And we are going to hear that story because Walton is going to be writing it in letters to his sister. And that is part of the genius of Mary Shelley's book. Next week, we start with Victor's childhood. It's actually a very good chapter and a remarkably important chapter. If you have a chance to, do go and listen to Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Maybe after Frankenstein is done, we'll listen to it. It's going to take an entire episode. It's a long poem, but it's a very good poem. And if you've never listened to Coleridge before with any kind of purpose, he may have been on drugs, but he was a really good writer. And Rime of the Ancient Mariner is a fantastic, as well as a relatively disturbing poem. And I can tell you with absolute confidence that the two gentlemen, Ted and Terry, who wrote the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, were well acquainted with Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And quite a bit of the film relied on bits and pieces of that text. I'm going to go rest my voice because I can already feel it starting to die again. I can feel the gravel coming back, and I'm having a harder and harder time breathing. So until next week, I hope you have a wonderful time. Kalia, congratulations for winning the CraftLit Charm of the Month for October. Thank you all again for writing to me on Ravelry, on my blogs, to mamaonits@gmail.com. And thank you for my fabulous box of autumn leaves. Oh my gosh, I completely forgot to thank you, Sandra, for sending that. That was so sweet of you. And I hope all of you are enjoying autumn because it's still 85 degrees here. Welcome to CraftLit, the podcast for crafters who like books. My name is Heather Wardover, and I'm podcasting from my corner of the Sonoran Desert, the Old Pueblo, Tucson, Arizona. Episode 77, Just Breathe. Well, hello. I feel so bad. And not just feeling bad because I've been feeling so bloody awful, but feeling bad because it's been so long since I've talked to you. I have missed you. I have missed podcasting. I've missed the whole thing, which I know sounds kind of crazy. It's like, wow, that's something you have to do after long days at work. But boy, I really have missed it. I've been listening to Frankenstein religiously, making notes and trying to figure out what to say and doing my research, and nothing. I haven't been able to do anything about it. So here I am, back again, with my new theme, Breathe. And now I think it's time that we bloody well turn our attention to Frankenstein. So, when last we left our intrepid explorer, Walton had just gotten Victor to the point where Victor, it looked like, was about to tell his story. Now, this being a romantic novel, the background story on Victor is going to be romantic. And I don't mean, again, Hallmark romantic, but romantic in that kind of windswept vista and tormented childhood. It verges on Gothic. It's not all the way there yet. But Mary Shelley is certainly the precursor to what we think of as Gothic literature. And this book is the one that did it. The guy who is reading this doesn't know how to pronounce the word indefatigable, and I am so sorry for that. And I considered re-recording the whole chapter, but he does a pretty good job with everything else. So pardon his lousy pronunciation, and I apologize for it. But I'm going to break into the chapter as necessary, just to point out a few little romantic thingies and keep you on track. So this is the beginning of Victor's story.
Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus, by Mary Shelley. Chapter 1. I am by birth a Genevese, and my family is one of the most distinguished of that republic. My ancestors had been for many years counselors and syndics, and my father had filled several public situations with honor and reputation. He was respected by all who knew him for his integrity and indefatigable attention to public business. He passed his younger days perpetually occupied by the affairs of his country. A variety of circumstances had prevented his marrying early, nor was it until the decline of life that he became a husband and the father of a family. As the circumstances of his marriage illustrate his character, I cannot refrain from relating them. One of his most intimate friends was a merchant who, from a flourishing state, fell through numerous mischances into poverty. This man, whose name was Beaufort, was of a proud and unbending disposition, and could not bear to live in poverty and oblivion in the same country where he had formerly been distinguished for his rank and magnificence. Having paid his debts, therefore, in the most honorable manner, he retreated with his daughter to the town of Lucerne, where he lived unknown and in wretchedness. My father loved Beaufort with the truest friendship and was deeply grieved by his retreat in these unfortunate circumstances. He bitterly deplored the false pride which led his friend to a conduct so little worthy of the affection that united them. He lost no time in endeavoring to seek him out, with the hope of persuading him to begin the world again through his credit and assistance. Beaufort had taken effectual measures to conceal himself, and it was 10 months before my father discovered his abode. Overjoyed at this discovery, he hastened to the house, which was situated in a mean street near the Reus. But when he entered, misery and despair alone welcomed him. Beaufort had saved but a very small sum of money from the wreck of his fortunes, but it was sufficient to provide him with sustenance for some months, and in the meantime he hoped to procure some respectable employment in a merchant's house. The interval was, consequently, spent in inaction. His grief only became more deep and rankling when he had leisure for reflection, and at length it took so fast hold of his mind that at the end of 3 months he lay on a bed of sickness, incapable of any exertion. His daughter attended him with the greatest tenderness, but she saw with despair that their little fund was rapidly decreasing, and that there was no other prospect of support. But Caroline Beaufort possessed a mind of an uncommon mold, and her courage rose to support her in her adversity. She procured plain work, she plaited straw, and by various means contrived to earn a pittance scarcely sufficient to support life. Several months passed in this manner. Her father grew worse, her time was more entirely occupied in attending him, her means of subsistence decreased, and in the 10th month her father died in her arms, leaving her an orphan and a beggar. This last blow overcame her, and she knelt by Beaufort's coffin, weeping bitterly, when my father entered the chamber. He came like a protecting spirit to the poor girl, who committed herself to his care, and after the interment of his friend he conducted her to Geneva and placed her under the protection of a relation. 2 years after this event, Caroline became his wife.
Okay, this next bit gets kind of interesting. Remember that Mary Shelley's mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, was married to a great thinker of the age. Both of them were actually quite well known in intellectual circles for being real powerhouses. And and then also you have to remember, I'm trying to do this delicately, that Mary was 16, I think, when she ran off with Percy. So there's a distinct difference in the age between Mary and her husband. And I have to double check, but I think there was a distance in age between her mother and her father as well. Mary is doing an interesting thing here because in some ways she is transposing elements of her childhood onto a male character, which creates some really interesting psychological issues. Because Mary's female, and of course her relationship with her mother, who died in childbirth, is going to be a little bit fraught. To have Victor have issues with his mother puts it in a whole different light. And so you're going to be hearing some things in this section that are interesting and that will come up again later.
There was a considerable difference between the ages of my parents, but this circumstance seemed to unite them only closer in bonds of devoted affection. There was a sense of justice in my father's upright mind which rendered it unnecessary that he should approve highly to love strongly. Perhaps during former years he had suffered from the late discovered unworthiness of one beloved, and so was disposed to set a greater value on tried worth. There was a show of gratitude and worship in his attachment to my mother, differing wholly from the doting fondness of age, for it was inspired by reverence for her virtues and a desire to be the means of, in some degree, recompensing her for the sorrows she had endured, but which gave inexpressible grace to his behavior to her. Everything was made to yield to her wishes and her convenience. He strove to shelter her, as a fair exotic is sheltered by the gardener, from every rougher wind, and to surround her with all that could tend to excite pleasurable emotion in her soft and benevolent mind. Her health, and even the tranquility of her hitherto constant spirit, had been shaken by what she had gone through. During the 2 years that had elapsed previous to their marriage, my father had gradually relinquished all his public functions, and immediately after their union they sought the pleasant climate of Italy and the change of scene and interest attendant on a tour through that land of wonders as a restorative for her weakened frame. From Italy they visited Germany and France. I, their eldest child, was born at Naples, and as an infant accompanied them in their rambles. I remained for several years their only child. Much as they were attached to each other, they seemed to draw inexhaustible stores of affection from a very mine of love to bestow them upon me. My mother's tender caresses and my father's smile of benevolent pleasure while regarding me are my first recollections. I was their plaything and their idol, and something better, their child.
So here again, this is something that Mary never experienced. She did not have any contact with her mother. I think her mom died a week, maybe 11 days after she was born. And her father, Henry Godwin, was, I don't think he was a bad father. I think he was an intellectual and, not necessarily the most doting parent around. She certainly grew up around a lot of really smart people. But here she is describing this loving childhood full of physical contact that you just have to think probably was not her own, which makes it all the more impressive that she was so young when she wrote this.
The innocent and helpless creature bestowed upon them by heaven, whom to bring up to good, and whose future lot it was in their hands to direct to happiness or misery, according as they fulfilled their duties toward me.
Okay, that part bears repeating, and I'm going to actually play that again for you because you need to hear this. It is foreshadowing, and it is very important to understand the importance that Mary puts upon taking responsibility for your own creations.
The innocent and helpless creature bestowed upon them by heaven, whom to bring up to good, and whose future lot it was in their hands to direct to happiness or misery, according as they fulfilled their duties toward me. With this deep consciousness of what they owed towards the being to which they had given life, added to the active spirit of tenderness that animated both, it may be imagined that while during every hour of my infant life I received a lesson of patience, of charity, and of self-control, and was so guided by a silken cord that all seemed but one train of enjoyment to me. For a long time I was their only care. My mother had much desired to have a daughter, but I continued their single offspring. When I was about 5 years old, while making an excursion beyond the frontiers of Italy, they had passed a week on the shores of the Lake of Como. Their benevolent disposition often made them enter the cottages of the poor. This, to my mother, was more than a duty. It was a necessity, a passion, remembering what she had suffered and how she had been relieved. For her to act in her turn the guardian angel to the afflicted. During one of their walks, a poor cot in the foldings of a veil attracted their notice as being singularly disconsolate, while the number of half-clothed children gathered about it spoke of penury of its worst shape. One day, when my father had gone by himself to Milan, my mother, accompanied by me, visited this abode. She found a peasant and his wife hard-working, bent down by care and labor, distributing a scanty meal to 5 hungry babes. Among these there was one which attracted my mother far above all the rest. She appeared of a different stock. The 4 others were dark-eyed, hardy little vagrants. This child was thin and very fair. Her hair was the brightest living gold, and despite the poverty of her clothing, seemed to set a crown of distinction on her head. Her brow was clear and ample, her blue eyes cloudless, and her lips and the molding of her face so expressive of sensibility and sweetness that none could behold her without looking on her as of a distinct species, a being heaven-sent, and bearing a celestial stamp in all her features. The peasant woman, perceiving that my mother fixed eyes of wonder and admiration on this lovely girl, eagerly communicated her history. She was not her child, but the daughter of a Milanese noblewoman. Her mother was a German and had died on giving her birth. The infant had been placed with these good people to nurse. They were better off then. They had not been long married, and their eldest child was but just born. The father of their charge was one of those Italians nursed in the memory of the antique glory of Italy, one among the Schiavi Agnor Frementi, who exerted himself to obtain the liberty of his country. He became the victim of its weakness. Whether he had died or still lingered in the dungeons of Austria was not known. His property was confiscated, his child became an orphan and a beggar. She continued with her foster parents and bloomed in their rude abode, fairer than a garden rose among dark-leaved brambles. When my father returned from Milan, he found playing with me in the hall of our villa a child fairer than the pictured cherub, a creature who seemed to shed radiance from all her looks, and whose form and motions were lighter than the chamois of the hills. The apparition was soon explained. With his permission, my mother prevailed on her rustic guardians to yield their charge to her. They were fond of the sweet orphan. Her presence had seemed a blessing to them, but it would be unfair to her to keep her in poverty and want when Providence offered her such powerful protection. They consulted their village priest, and the result was that Elizabeth Lavenza became the inmate of my parents' house. My more than sister, the beautiful and adored companion of all my occupations and my pleasures. Everyone loved Elizabeth. The passionate and almost reverential attachment with which all regarded her became, while I shared it, my pride and my delight. On the evening previous to her being brought to my home, my mother said playfully, "I have a present for my Victor. Tomorrow he shall have it." And when, on the morrow, she presented Elizabeth to me as her promised gift, I, with childish seriousness, interpreted her words literally, and looked upon Elizabeth as mine to protect, love, and cherish. All praises I bestowed on her I received as made to a possession of my own. We called each other familiarly by the name of cousin. No word, no expression could body forth the kind of relation in which she stood to me, my more than sister, since till death she was to be mine only. End of chapter 1.
Okay, so the first thing that comes to my mind is, well, the description of Elizabeth in the book is way different from Elizabeth in Young Frankenstein. I don't know if you remember, but Madeline Kahn played Elizabeth, and she is spectacular. And in fact, I'm going to do my best to play some audio every once in a while from that movie, because I actually really feel that Mel Brooks and Gene Wilder, in writing Young Frankenstein, did more service to getting the real story of the monster out. Because I think the old 1930s Boris Karloff movies are, they're great monster movies, but they're not this book. And certainly Brooks and Wilder were copying the look and the feel of those old movies, but I really think that their take on the monster is pretty dead on. And in fact, if you've watched that movie lately, you'll find that there are many scenes that they lifted from the book that they put their own twist on to make it funny. And then sometimes they actually didn't have to do much at all to make it funny or different, because it's pretty close to the book. Anyway, on to chapter 2. And we're going to talk at more length about the title and subtitle. It's Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus. And when I finally get a chance to interview my Frankenstein scholar, this is one of the things that we'll be discussing, is why Mary chose that particular moniker for the title. The reader that we're about to listen to, you actually heard quite a bit on Tale of Two Cities. Her name is Kara Schallenberg, and she's recorded quite a bit for LibriVox.
Chapter 2. We were brought up together. There was not quite a year of difference in our ages. I need not say that we were strangers to any species of disunion or dispute. Harmony was the soul of our companionship, and the diversity and contrast that subsisted in our characters drew us nearer together. Elizabeth was of a calmer and more concentrated disposition. But with all my ardor, I was capable of a more intense application, and was more deeply smitten with the thirst for knowledge. She busied herself with following the aerial creations of the poets, and in the majestic and wondrous scenes which surrounded our Swiss home. The sublime shapes of the mountains, the changes of the seasons, tempest and calm, the silence of winter, and the life and turbulence of our alpine summers. She found ample scope for admiration and delight.
So, according to Victor, Elizabeth is the classic romantic. She loves nature. She loves the kind of grand vista of natural phenomenon. She likes kind of the wild edge of those phenomenon. And in fact, you'll hear more about that shortly. But it's good because you get Victor, who's kind of the science edge of the romantic thing, in that he's interested in the supernatural, and that you have Elizabeth, who's kind of the natural, supernatural one. Victor's the one who strays because he falls too much under the sway of science. And again, the romantics were in reaction to the Enlightenment and all things logical and scientific. So you'll hear more of those parallels coming up.
While my companion contemplated with a serious and satisfied spirit the magnificent appearances of things, I delighted in investigating their causes. The world was to me a secret which I desired to divine. Curiosity, earnest research to learn the hidden laws of nature, gladness akin to rapture as they were unfolded to me, are among the earliest sensations I can remember. On the birth of a second son, my junior by 7 years, my parents gave up entirely their wandering life and fixed themselves in their native country. We possessed a house in Geneva and a campaign on Bellerive, the eastern shore of the lake, at the distance of rather more than a league from the city. We resided principally in the latter, and the lives of my parents were passed in considerable seclusion. It was my temper to avoid a crowd, and to attach myself fervently to a few. I was indifferent, therefore, to my schoolfellows in general, but I united myself in the bonds of the closest friendship to one among them. Henry Clerval was the son of a merchant of Geneva. He was a boy of singular talent and fancy. He loved enterprise, hardship, and even danger for its own sake. He was deeply read in books of chivalry and romance. He composed heroic songs and began to write many a tale of enchantment and knightly adventure. He tried to make us act plays and to enter into masquerades, in which the characters were drawn from the heroes of Roncesvalles, of the Round Table of King Arthur, and the chivalrous train who shed their blood to redeem the Holy Sepulchre from the hands of the infidels. No human being could have passed a happier childhood than myself. My parents were possessed by the very spirit of kindness and indulgence. We felt that they were not the tyrants to rule our lot according to their caprice, but the agents and creators of all the many delights which we enjoyed. When I mingled with other families, I distinctly discerned how peculiarly fortunate my lot was, and gratitude assisted the development of filial love. My temper was sometimes violent, and my passions vehement, but by some law in my temperature they were turned not towards childish pursuits, but to an eager desire to learn, and not to learn all things indiscriminately. I confess that neither the structure of languages, nor the code of governments, nor the politics of various states possessed attractions for me. It was the secrets of heaven and earth that I desired to learn, and whether it was the outward substance of things or the inner spirit of nature and the mysterious soul of man that occupied me, still my inquiries were directed to the metaphysical, or in its highest sense, the physical secrets of the world. Meanwhile, Clerval occupied himself, so to speak, with the moral relations of things. The busy stage of life, the virtues of heroes, and the actions of men were his theme, and his hope and his dream was to become one among those whose names are recorded in story as the gallant and adventurous benefactors of our species. The saintly soul of Elizabeth shone like a shrine-dedicated lamp in our peaceful home. Her sympathy was ours. Her smile, her soft voice, the sweet glance of her celestial eyes were ever there to bless and animate us. She was the living spirit of love to soften and attract. I might have become sullen in my study, rough through the ardor of my nature, but that she was there to subdue me to a semblance of her own gentleness. And Clerval, could aught ill entrench on the noble spirit of Clerval? Yet he might not have been so perfectly humane, so thoughtful in his generosity, so full of kindness and tenderness amidst his passion for adventurous exploit, had she not unfolded to him the real loveliness of beneficence, and made the doing good the end and aim of his soaring ambition. I feel exquisite pleasure in dwelling on the recollections of childhood, before misfortune had tainted my mind and changed its bright visions of extensive usefulness into gloomy and narrow reflections upon self. Besides, in drawing the picture of my early days, I also record those events which led, by insensible steps, to my aftertale of misery. For when I would account to myself for the birth of that passion which ever afterwards ruled my destiny, I find it arise, like a mountain river, from ignoble and almost forgotten sources. But swelling as it proceeded, it became the torrent which, in its course, has swept away all my hopes and joys. Natural philosophy is the genius that has regulated my fate. I desire, therefore, in this narration, to state those facts which led to my predilection for that science. When I was 13 years of age, we all went on a party of pleasure to the baths near Thonon. The inclemency of the weather obliged us to remain a day confined to the inn. In this house I chanced to find a volume of the works of Cornelius Agrippa. I opened it with apathy. The theory which he attempts to demonstrate and the wonderful facts which he relates soon changed this feeling into enthusiasm. A new light seemed to dawn upon my mind, and bounding with joy, I communicated my discovery to my father. My father looked carelessly at the title page of my book and said, "Ah, Cornelius Agrippa. My dear Victor, do not waste your time upon this. It is sad trash." If, instead of this remark, my father had taken the pains to explain to me that the principles of Agrippa had been entirely exploded, and that a modern system of science had been introduced which possessed much greater powers than the ancient, because the powers of the latter were chimerical, while those of the former were real and practical. Under such circumstances, I should certainly have thrown Agrippa aside and have contented my imagination, warmed as it was, by returning with greater ardor to my former studies.
I think it's worth noting here that the speech that Victor just gave about how if his father had only ... I have always felt about Victor that he's an excuse maker. And that this is the beginning of that, oh, if someone had only warned me, oh, if only someone had only pulled me aside, oh, if only this had happened. And yet his actions at various points towards this book seem to me to point to the fact that had anyone actually tried to do that, he wouldn't have listened anyway. It is an interesting fact because, of course, it's a first-person narrative, so you don't know who you can trust. But that's just something that has stuck with me, so listen for it and see if I'm right.
It is even possible that the train of my ideas would never have received the fatal impulse that led to my ruin. But the cursory glance my father had taken of my volume by no means assured me that he was acquainted with its contents, and I continued to read with the greatest avidity. When I returned home, my first care was to procure the whole works of this author, and afterwards of Paracelsus and Albertus Magnus. I read and studied the wild fancies of these writers with delight. They appeared to me treasures known to few besides myself. I have described myself as always having been imbued with a fervent longing to penetrate the secrets of nature. In spite of the intense labor and wonderful discoveries of modern philosophers, I always came from my studies discontented and unsatisfied. Sir Isaac Newton is said to have avowed that he felt like a child picking up shells beside the great and unexplored ocean of truth. Those of his successors in each branch of natural philosophy with whom I was acquainted appeared even to my boy's apprehensions as tyros engaged in the same pursuit. The untaught peasant beheld the elements around him and was acquainted with their practical uses. The most learned philosopher knew little more. He had partially unveiled the face of nature, but her immortal lineaments were still a wonder and a mystery. He might dissect, anatomize, and give names, but, not to speak of a final cause, causes in their secondary and tertiary grades were utterly unknown to him. I had gazed upon the fortifications and impediments that seemed to keep human beings from entering the citadel of nature, and rashly and ignorantly I had repined. But here were books, and here were men who had penetrated deeper and knew more. I took their word for all that they averred, and I became their disciple. It may appear strange that such should arise in the 18th century, but while I followed the routine of education in the schools of Geneva, I was, to a great degree, self-taught with regard to my favorite studies. My father was not scientific, and I was left to struggle with a child's blindness, added to a student's thirst for knowledge. Under the guidance of my new preceptors, I entered with the greatest diligence into the search of the philosopher's stone and the elixir of life, but the latter soon obtained my undivided attention.
Okay, just a personal note on lame American stuff. You just heard her mention the Philosopher's Stone. I don't know if you remember, but the original title of the first Harry Potter book is Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, not the Sorcerer's Stone as it was released in the United States. That's because other educated countries know that the Philosopher's Stone was an actual thing. You're hearing a lot of alchemy being discussed by Victor, and the Philosopher's Stone was a part of that, like the elixir of life, this idea that you could find a way to live forever if only ... So here it is, proof positive that the Philosopher's Stone is a thing, and we had to change it to the Sorcerer's Stone to sell the book, because somehow American children just wouldn't have bought the book otherwise. Stuff like that drives me nuts. Okay, back to the story.
Wealth was an inferior object, but what glory would attend the discovery if I could banish disease from the human frame and render man invulnerable to any but a violent death? Nor were these my only visions. The raising of ghosts or devils was a promise liberally accorded by my favorite authors, the fulfillment of which I most eagerly sought, and if my incantations were always unsuccessful, I attributed the failure rather to my own inexperience and mistake than to a want of skill or fidelity in my instructors. And thus, for a time, I was occupied by exploded systems, mingling, like an unadept, 1,000 contradictory theories, and floundering desperately in a very slough of multifarious knowledge, guided by an ardent imagination and childish reasoning, till an accident again changed the current of my ideas. When I was about 15 years old, we had retired to our house near Bellerive, when we witnessed a most violent and terrible thunderstorm. It advanced from behind the mountains of Jura, and the thunder burst at once with frightful loudness from various quarters of the heavens. I remained, while the storm lasted, watching its progress with curiosity and delight. As I stood at the door, on a sudden I beheld a stream of fire issue from an old and beautiful oak, which stood about 20 yards from our house. And so soon as the dazzling light vanished, the oak had disappeared, and nothing remained but a blasted stump. When we visited it the next morning, we found the tree shattered in a singular manner. It was not splintered by the shock, but entirely reduced to thin ribbons of wood. I never beheld anything so utterly destroyed. Before this, I was not unacquainted with the more obvious laws of electricity. On this occasion, a man of great research in natural philosophy was with us, and excited by this catastrophe, he entered on the explanation of a theory which he had formed on the subject of electricity and galvanism, which was at once new and astonishing to me. All that he said threw greatly into the shade Cornelius Agrippa, Albertus Magnus, and Paracelsus, the lords of my imagination. But by some fatality, the overthrow of these men disinclined me to pursue my accustomed studies. It seemed to me as if nothing would or could ever be known. All that had so long engaged my attention suddenly grew despicable. By one of those caprices of the mind, which we are perhaps most subject to in early youth, I at once gave up my former occupations, set down natural history and all its progeny as a deformed and abortive creation, and entertained the greatest disdain for a would-be science which could never even step within the threshold of real knowledge. In this mood of mind, I betook myself to the mathematics and the branches of study appertaining to that science as being built upon secure foundations, and so worthy of my consideration. Thus, strangely, are our souls constructed, and by such slight ligaments are we bound to prosperity or ruin. When I look back, it seems to me as if this almost miraculous change of inclination and will was the immediate suggestion of the guardian angel of my life, the last effort made by the spirit of preservation to avert the storm that was even then hanging in the stars and ready to envelop me. Her victory was announced by an unusual tranquility and gladness of soul which followed the relinquishing of my ancient and latterly tormenting studies. It was thus that I was to be taught to associate evil with their prosecution, happiness with their disregard. It was a strong effort of the spirit of good, but it was ineffectual. Destiny was too potent, and her immutable laws had decreed my utter and terrible destruction. End of chapter 2.
Alrighty, so the stage is set for Victor and Elizabeth and Clerval to play out some diabolical future together. I hope that Victor's kind of, I don't want to be too hard on him right now, but kind of his petulance, certainly his mercurial nature about how easily he changes from being all into studying Agrippa and then kind of tossing it out the window one day because of a chance occurrence and replacing it with mathematics. This kind of, it's not really all or nothing, but certainly these kind of total changeovers of his mind, they're setting him up for what will come next. I would play chapters 3 and 4 for you. They're recorded together next, but it would be a little bit too long, and I don't want this to be undownloadable. But this does give you a very important beginning of understanding and seeing who Victor Frankenstein is, that he had a remarkably calm and trouble-free childhood. We probably would call him spoiled. if he were alive today. He certainly had access to anything he ever needed. Clerval comes from a upper middle class family. His father is working, I think, in as a merchant. Clerval doesn't want to do this. He wants to be like Victor. Victor has all the money in the world and has the ability to sit around and read useless alchemy. It's definitely setting him up for having a very difficult time making adult decisions. You know how, I think I've told the story before of a party my dad threw one time, and they have a balcony. They have a ground floor, which is kind of below the ground, and then the top floor, which is where you enter. And so the top floor has a balcony. The floor below, kind of the basement / ground floor, you walk out to a pool. And my dad had a party at one point, and there was a small child, he's 4 years old, who tore the place up, literally. I mean, some of their furniture is still stained. They've had to flip cushions. Something got ripped. One of their cushions got ripped. And the mother just stood there blithely doing nothing. And my dad was getting more and more irked because, of course, he raised his children right. And it ended with the child climbing the railing over the pool deck. He wouldn't have fallen into the pool. He would have fallen onto the concrete. And my dad raced over, threw open a different set of doors than the one that was open, and grabbed the child and said, "Don't do that. No, don't do that. What are you thinking, you moron?" And the mother looked at him, shocked, grabbed her son, and said, "I want to raise my son so he'll never have to hear the word no." And my dad said, "Well, then I guess you're going to raise a monster, aren't you?" And the woman got very huffy and left. And it was something that happened before, obviously before I had children, but even back then, it seemed kind of obvious to me that children need limits. They need boundaries. They need to know that the world is safe. And this is where Bruno Bettelheim starts talking about, in the uses of enchantment, he starts talking about kind of the need for those dark stories, that you don't go into the woods alone. Bad things are there. And that makes children feel all the more safe being home with their parents. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. And of course, it's very interesting reading the Jasper Fforde books, like The Fourth Bear, which is the one I'm on right now, and reading all about the Goldilocks and the Three Bears storyline, because it's not entirely a different take on the whole thing. If you haven't ever checked out Bettelheim and Joseph Campbell, I read at the same time, The Uses of Enchantment and The Powers of Myth. And they complement each other very nicely, and they are fascinating, I think, in how they approach story and the importance of story and our understanding of story in our lives and how important they are. And how important they are in children's lives, how very, very much we need to have kind of a mythic arc to life. And this book definitely draws on those needs. We are watching Victor set out on his journey, but even more importantly, soon, very soon, we will be watching the monster set out on his journey. And his is the road less taken. I think I'm going to end there for tonight. I have had to drink a whole lot of tea to keep this up, and I am going to go rest my voice and rest my body, and then I'll do another podcast next week. I hope you are all well. I sure hope you're better than I've been, and I hope that I find you well again next week as we head into the frightfully fraught and very, very busy holiday season. Don't forget, if you want to donate during the month of November, you will be placed into the drawing for the third of the Jen Minnis CraftLit charms. We have one for November and one left for December donations. And I think all of the goodies have been sent out to last month's donation winners. So go ahead and send in your contributions, and we'll put you in the drawing for this month or December. Have a great week, you guys. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
You can find show notes for this episode and links to other episodes at craftlit.com. CraftLit also appears anywhere you can get a podcast: iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and on, including its own dedicated app. There are lots of ways to support CraftLit, from patreon.com/craftlit to craftlit.com memberships and channel memberships on YouTube. You can find out more details at craftlit.com/premium. And as always, thank you for your support. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on.